In the hot midsummer of 1883, in a poor farming village in northern Italy, a boy was born who would eventually throw his nation into chaos. The village was Dovia di Predapio, located in the Romagna region. Romagna was a place known across Italy for its harsh hills, stubborn farmers, and violent political passions. It was not a place of quiet compromise. In Romagna, people took their beliefs to extremes. Quarrels were settled with knives, and political debates in the local taverns often ended in brawls. Poverty was widespread, the soil was hard to farm, and ordinary people felt bitter toward the wealthy landowners, the Catholic Church, and the distant government in Rome. It was in this fierce environment, on July 29, 1883, that Rosa Maltoni gave birth to her first child, a heavy, dark-haired boy. Her husband, Alessandro Mussolini, named the infant Benito Amilcare Andrea. Every single one of those names was a political statement. Alessandro was a committed socialist with strong anarchist sympathies. He chose Benito after Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary leader who had executed Emperor Maximilian. Amilcare came from Amilcare Cipriani, a famous Italian anarchist patriot. Andrea came from Andrea Costa, the first socialist elected to the Italian parliament. Through these three names, Alessandro dedicated his newborn son to revolution before the child could even speak. The Mussolini household was small, poor, and constantly divided by two very different views of the world. Alessandro Mussolini was the village blacksmith. His forge was the political heart of Dovia. Day and night, the metal rhythm of Alessandro's hammer echoed down the dirt street, followed by the heavy smell of coal smoke and hot iron. Local peasants and workers gathered around the warmth of the fire to hear Alessandro speak. He was an intense, passionate man who could barely read, yet he possessed a strong, booming voice and a fiery imagination. Alessandro rejected God, hated the king, and despised the wealthy. He filled his head with the radical ideas of Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin. He dreamed of a day when the poor would rise up, smash the churches, overthrow the government, and take the land for themselves. While Alessandro hammered away at his anvil and preached revolution to his neighbors, his wife, Rosa Maltoni, lived a completely different life. Rosa was the local elementary school teacher. She was quiet, deeply pious, and devoted to the Catholic Church. Rosa represented order, traditional morality, and religious faith. She worked hard to keep her family respected and fed, often worrying about how her husband's political trouble would affect their future. Alessandro spent his small earnings on radical newspapers, alcohol, and political meetings, leaving Rosa to stretch every copper coin as far as it could go. Benito grew up in the middle of this intense ideological tug-of-war. The family lived in two crowded rooms on the second floor of a dilapidated building that also served as Rosa's primary schoolroom. The floorboards were old and creaked underfoot, and the cold winter winds blew easily through the cracks in the walls. Food was basic and often scarce: plain cornmeal porridge, vegetables from a small garden, bread, and occasionally a small piece of pork. From his earliest years, Benito was not an easy child to handle. He was silent, sullen, and quick to anger. While other children played together in the fields, Benito preferred to wander alone through the rocky hills around Predapio, throwing stones at birds or staring down into the river valleys. He possessed an unusual amount of physical strength for his age, along with a dark, heavy gaze that made adults uncomfortable. When he did interact with other children, he wanted to dominate them. If another child refused to obey him, Benito responded with immediate violence. He used his fists, rocks, or whatever object was close at hand. He did not show remorse after a fight. Instead, he would retreat into a cold, defiant silence. His father's forge became young Benito's true classroom. As soon as he was old enough to help, Benito was put to work pulling the heavy leather bellows to keep the blacksmith's fire burning. As the sparks flew into the dark room, Benito listened carefully to the men talking. He heard his father rail against the injustice of the rich, the hypocrisy of the priests, and the weakness of the Italian state. Alessandro taught his son that the world was divided into two groups, the oppressors and the oppressed. If a man wanted to survive and change his fate, he had to be strong, fearless, and ruthless. Alessandro also taught Benito how to read from socialist pamphlets and radical newspapers. By the time Benito was 8 years old, he was sitting on the wooden counter of the forge, reading political articles aloud to illiterate farm workers who stood around listening in silence. Benito loved the feeling of having an audience. He discovered that when he spoke or read aloud, people stopped to listen to him. It gave him an early taste of power. At the same time, his mother Rosa tried her best to tame his violent nature. She taught him basic manners, made him pray, and tried to instill a respect for education and religious discipline. But Benito rejected his mother's faith. He saw religion as a sign of weakness. To Benito, the gentle, forgiving message of Jesus Christ was meant for fools and cowards. He was far more attracted to his father's world of conflict, iron, and struggle. By the time Benito reached the age of 9, his violent behavior had become a serious problem in the village. He was constantly getting into fights at the local school, damaging property, and terrorizing smaller children. Rosa realized that if her son remained in Predappio, he would end up as an uneducated laborer or in prison. Despite their lack of money, Rosa insisted that Benito must be sent away to a proper boarding school where strict discipline might straighten him out. In the autumn of 1892, 9-year-old Benito was sent to the Salesian monastery school at Faenza, a town a few miles away. The Salesians were a Catholic religious order known for strict rules and traditional teaching methods. For young Benito, entering the monastery school was a miserable experience. The priests ran the school with rigid discipline. Silences were enforced, prayers were required multiple times a day, and any disobedience was punished with physical beating or public humiliation. To make matters worse, the school was strictly divided by social class. The sons of wealthy aristocrats and prosperous merchants ate at comfortable tables with good food and wore clean uniforms. The poor boys, including Benito, were made to sit at separate tables, ate inferior meals, and were treated with obvious disdain by both the teachers and the wealthier students. This obvious social division burned into Benito's mind. He felt deeply humiliated by his family's poverty. He hated the rich boys who looked down on him, and he hated the priests who enforced the rules. Instead of making him submissive, the strict environment of the monastery school fueled his rage and resentment. He became a constant troublemaker. He refused to pray, hid during religious services, and organized small rebellions among the poorer boys. His temper grew more dangerous. In 1894, when he was 11 years old, a dispute broke out in the schoolyard between Benito and an older boy from a wealthier background. In a fit of wild rage, Benito pulled a small penknife from his pocket and plunged it into the older boy's hand. The school was horrified. A knife attack in a religious school was an unforgivable offense. Benito was immediately isolated from the other students, and the priests decided to expel him. Only after his mother Rosa rushed to the school and pleaded tearfully with the directors was the punishment slightly reduced. Benito was allowed to finish the school year, but he was permanently banned from returning. He returned to Predappio disgraced, but he showed no regret. In his mind, he was not the offender. He was the victim of a corrupt and unjust system. The incident at Faenza revealed a clear pattern that would follow Benito Mussolini for the rest of his life. When faced with resistance or disrespect, his default reaction was sudden, extreme violence. Realizing that Benito still needed an education to secure a decent career, his parents saved every penny they could and enrolled him in a public secondary school in the town of Forlimpopoli in 1895. The Giasu Carducci school in Forlimpopoli was very different from the monastery in Finza. It was a secular, state-run institution influenced by modern nationalist and liberal ideas. The atmosphere was less oppressive, and Benito found it easier to fit in, though his difficult personality remained unchanged. As he grew into a teenager, Benito's physical appearance took clear shape. He was short, broad-shouldered, and thick-necked, with a wide jaw, dark piercing eyes, and an intense expression. He rarely smiled. He carried himself with a strange, self-important posture, keeping his chest thrown out and his chin lifted high. Even among his new classmates, Benito stood out as a loner and a radical. He had very few close friends because he could not tolerate anyone who disagreed with him. He insisted on leading every group he joined. If his classmates were discussing sports, literature, or politics, Benito would dominate the conversation, shouting down anyone who tried to interrupt him. At Forlimpopoli, Benito's intellectual life expanded rapidly. He read voraciously, devouring books on history, geography, and political theory. He was particularly drawn to the works of radical thinkers who praised violence, power, and revolution. He read the works of Giuseppe Garibaldi, the charismatic hero who had helped unify Italy through force of arms. He also studied the writings of European socialists who predicted the violent overthrow of the capitalist system. It was during these high school years that Benito began to refine his talent for public speaking and writing. He joined the local socialist youth groups and started attending political rallies across the region. He quickly realized that he possessed a natural ability to captivate an audience. His voice was deep, loud, and dramatic. He did not speak like a careful academic. He spoke like a preacher of revolution. He used short, punchy sentences, dramatic gestures, and aggressive language that stirred the emotions of working-class listeners. In 1900, at the age of 17, Benito officially joined the Italian Socialist Party, SI. He was no longer just the rebellious son of a village blacksmith. He was now a registered political activist. He began writing short articles for local socialist newspapers, attacking the Italian government, the monarchy, and the Catholic Church with fiery language. Yet, despite his growing political activity, his violent temper continued to cause trouble. During his time at Forlimpopoli, he was involved in another knife fight. Once again, during an argument with a local youth over a girl, Benito drew a blade and wounded his opponent. The police were brought in, and his academic career was almost cut short a second time. However, because of his good grades and the intervention of his teachers, he was allowed to stay and finish his studies. In July 1901, at the age of 18, Benito Mussolini graduated from the school at Forlimpopoli, earning an elementary school teaching diploma. On paper, he was now qualified to teach young children, just as his mother had done for decades. But Benito had no interest in a quiet, respectable life as a small-town schoolmaster. He was consumed by an overwhelming ambition. He felt destined for greatness, though he had no clear idea how he was going to achieve it. He looked around at the small towns of Romagna and felt suffocated by their narrow horizons. He wanted wealth, power, and fame, but he had no money and no social connections. To earn a living, he accepted a temporary teaching job in the town of Gualtieri, located in the province of Reggio Emilia, in February 1902. His time as a schoolmaster was a total disaster. Benito was completely unfit to teach young children. He lacked patience, hated routine, and paid little attention to the official school curriculum. Instead of teaching basic reading and arithmetic, He spent his classroom hours lecturing young students on political revolution, anti-clericalism, and social justice. Outside the classroom, his personal life was chaotic and wild. He spent his evenings in local taverns, drinking cheap wine, arguing politics with local workers, and engaging in aggressive romantic affairs with local women. He lived in a tiny, filthy rented room, neglected his clothes, and rarely washed. He took pride in his unkempt appearance, believing that a true revolutionary should look rugged, dangerous, and uncivilized. His arrogant behavior quickly alienated the town authorities and the respectable citizens of Gualtieri. When his temporary contract ended in June 1902, the town council refused to renew it. They were glad to see the strange, violent young teacher leave. Benito returned home to Predapio in the summer of 1902 feeling bitter and defeated. He was 19 years old, unemployed, and living once again under his parents' roof. His father's forge was struggling financially, and the family was poorer than ever. To make matters worse, Benito was facing another major problem: military service. Under Italian law, every young man who turned 19 was required to report for mandatory military service in the Italian Royal Army. For Benito, the thought of serving in the king's army was intolerable. His father had taught him to hate the military, viewing it as a tool used by the ruling class to oppress the workers. Furthermore, Benito detested the idea of obeying orders from military officers. He could not stand the thought of submitting his will to anyone else. He was faced with a stark choice: report to the Army Draft Board and submit to military discipline, or flee the country and live as an outlaw. For a young man driven by pride, rebellion, and a hatred of authority, the choice was simple. He decided to abandon Italy altogether. In July 1902, with a few small coins in his pocket, a single change of clothes wrapped in a bundle, and a heart full of bitterness and ambition, 19-year-old Benito Mussolini boarded a train heading north toward the Swiss border. He was leaving his homeland behind as a draft dodger, a penniless wanderer, and a radical agitator. He was stepping into the unknown, ready to fight the world on his own terms. When 19-year-old Benito Mussolini crossed the border into Switzerland in July 1902, he was not entering a peaceful haven. He was entering a desperate struggle for survival. He had no money, no steady employment, and no friends waiting for him at the station. In his pocket was a single nickel coin featuring the profile of King Umberto I, along with his schoolteacher's diploma and a small bundle of worn clothes. Switzerland at the turn of the 20th century was a haven for political exiles, draft dodgers, and radical intellectuals from across Europe. Russian revolutionaries, German Marxists, and Italian anarchists filled the taverns and cheap boarding houses of Geneva, Zurich, and Lausanne. For a young man who viewed himself as a persecuted political rebel, it seemed like the ideal setting. But the reality of life as an undocumented migrant worker hit Mussolini almost immediately. His first weeks in Switzerland were defined by grinding poverty and physical hardship. Arriving in the city of Lausanne, he slept under bridges, on park benches, or in cold wooden sheds. He survived on scraps of dry bread given to him by sympathetic Italian migrant laborers. To earn a few centimes, he took whatever brutal physical labor was available. He worked as a hod carrier on construction sites, lugging heavy bags of sand and stones up shaky wooden ladders until his shoulders bled. He worked as a stonecutter in a quarry, and as an assistant to a bricklayer. The physical labor degraded him, but it also deepened his hatred for the wealthy upper classes. He saw how hard Italian immigrants worked in foreign countries only to be treated like second-class human beings by Swiss authorities and employers. His pride, always intense, was deeply wounded by the humiliation of begging for food or being chased away by local police officers. In the summer of 1902, Swiss police arrested Mussolini in Lausanne for vagrancy. Lacking proper identification papers and money, he spent a night in a cold jail cell before being marched to the border and expelled from the canton of Vaud. Undeterred, he simply walked back into Switzerland through another district. This arrest was the first of many encounters with law enforcement that would populate his Swiss police dossier over the next 2 years. Despite the physical exhaustion of his days, Mussolini spent his evenings in the crowded back rooms of Swiss cafes, immersing himself in radical political theory. Switzerland was an intellectual boiling pot. In Geneva and Lausanne, Mussolini met veteran European socialists and Marxists who recognized the young Italian's intelligence and raw, unpolished passion. Among these radicals, one person had a profound influence on him: Angelika Balabanov. Balabanov was a wealthy Russian Jewish émigré who had abandoned her family's fortune to dedicate her life to the international socialist movement. Brilliant, multilingual, and deeply read in Marxist theory, she met Mussolini in 1903 when he was living in squalor. She saw in the young Italian a passionate but chaotic mind. Balabanov took Mussolini under her wing. She helped him translate radical German texts, including works by Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche, into Italian. She encouraged him to write political pamphlets and refined his crude political arguments. Under her guidance, Mussolini shifted from a chaotic, rebellious anarchist into a disciplined, ideological Marxist orator. Mussolini began giving speeches at meetings of Italian trade unions and socialist groups across Switzerland. He quickly built a reputation as a terrifyingly effective speaker. He did not deliver calm, policy-driven speeches. Instead, he screamed at his audiences, pacing across platforms like a caged animal, his dark eyes bulging with intensity. He denounced the Catholic Church as a cancer on society, condemned King Victor Emmanuel Roman III as a tyrant, and urged workers to prepare for a violent general strike that would tear down the capitalist state. His anti-religious speeches became legendary among the Italian workers in Switzerland. At a famous debate in Lausanne, Mussolini drew out a pocket watch, placed it on the table, and dramatically challenged God to strike him dead within 5 minutes to prove his existence. When 5 minutes passed and nothing happened, Mussolini smiled mockingly at the crowd and declared that God was either a myth or a coward. The crowd cheered wildly. Writing became another outlet for his aggression. Mussolini began contributing articles to socialist journals such as L'Avenir del Lavoratore, The Future of the Worker. His written style mirrored his speaking style, short, punchy, aggressive, and full of violent metaphors. He attacked moderate socialists who wanted to reform the government through elections, labeling them cowards and traitors to the working class. True socialism, Mussolini argued, could only be born through blood, fire, and total revolution. His radical activities did not go unnoticed by the Swiss police. In June 1903, after organizing a violent strike of Italian masonry workers in Bern, Mussolini was arrested again. The Swiss authorities considered him a dangerous agitator. He was jailed for 2 weeks and formally expelled from Switzerland. To avoid being turned over to Italian authorities, who still wanted him for dodging military service, Mussolini slipped back across the Swiss border illegally using forged documents. He moved from town to town, living under false names, sleeping in attic rooms, and relying on the financial solidarity of local socialist networks. It was during these wandering Swiss years that Mussolini's core worldview hardened. He read the French philosopher Georges Sorel, who argued that masses of people were not moved by logical arguments or economic statistics, but by powerful emotional myths. Ideas like the general strike or revolution that inspired men to sacrifice themselves. He also read Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas about the overman and the will to power. Mussolini began to combine these ideas into a potent personal philosophy. He believed that the majority of human beings were weak, passive sheep who needed a strong, ruthless leader to drive them toward history. He saw violence not just as a political tool, but as a cleansing, creative force. By 1904, the Italian government issued an amnesty for draft dodgers to celebrate the birth of the royal heir, Crown Prince Umberto. The amnesty meant Mussolini could return to Italy without facing immediate imprisonment, provided he fulfilled his mandatory military duty. Exhausted by 2 years of poverty, police harassment, and physical hardship in Switzerland, and learning that his mother Rosa was falling gravely ill with meningitis, Mussolini decided it was time to go home. In November 1904, the wandering radical crossed the border back into Italy, leaving behind his life as an undocumented laborer and entering the next phase of his turbulent youth. Mussolini returned to Italy in late 1904 as a marked man. The Italian police had opened a political dossier on him, labeling him a dangerous socialist agitator. To clear his legal record under the terms of the royal amnesty, he was forced to do what he had fled to Switzerland to avoid: join the Italian Royal Army. In January 1905, Mussolini reported to the 10th Bersaglieri Regiment stationed in Verona. The Bersaglieri were an elite light infantry unit, famous for their black feather-adorned helmets and fast-paced marching style. Surprisingly, the rebellious radical adapted well to military life. He found a strange satisfaction in the physical discipline, weapons training, and structured authority of the barracks. He proved to be a good soldier, keeping his uniform clean and obeying orders without outward protest. While serving in Verona, tragic news reached him from Predapio. In February 1905, his mother Rosa died at the age of 46. Mussolini was deeply shaken. Despite his rejection of her religious faith, he had loved his mother, and her death left him feeling isolated. He received temporary leave to attend her funeral, standing silently in the cold graveyard as his mother was buried according to the Catholic rites she had cherished. After completing his military service in September 1906, Mussolini returned to civil life. He attempted once more to work as a schoolteacher, taking jobs in Wunglia on the Italian Riviera and later near Udine. But his heart was no longer in education. His true passion was political struggle. Wherever he went, he organized local labor unions, wrote radical newspaper articles, and got involved in political brawls. His anti-clerical articles were so violent that he was repeatedly fired by school boards and hounded out of town by local authorities. By 1909, Mussolini realized that his future lay entirely in revolutionary journalism. He moved to Trento, an Italian-speaking city, then under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There, he worked as the editor of a radical working-class newspaper called L'Avvenire del Lavoratore and collaborated with Cesare Battisti, a famous Italian nationalist and socialist. In Trento, Mussolini refined his journalistic craft. He wrote dozens of articles attacking both the Austrian government and the local Catholic Church. He even wrote a trashy, sensationalist anti-clerical novel titled The Cardinal's Mistress, which portrayed the Catholic clergy as corrupt and immoral. His attacks on Austrian authority were so fierce that the imperial police arrested him, kept him in prison for a month, and finally expelled him from Austro-Hungarian territory in late 1909. He returned to his home region of Romagna, settling in the town of Forli. Romagna was a powder keg of agrarian conflict, where poor tenant farmers fought bitter battles against wealthy landowners. Mussolini was appointed secretary of the local Forli Socialist Party and became the editor of his own weekly newspaper, La Lotta di Classe, the class struggle. La Lotta di Classe was printed on cheap paper, but Mussolini's prose gave it dynamite force. He wrote every issue almost entirely by himself. He turned the paper into a weapon, using it to coordinate strikes, denounce landowning families by name, and call for open rebellion against the Italian state. Around this time, Mussolini settled down with Rachel Guidi, the young daughter of his father's new partner. Rachel was an uneducated, practical farm girl who cared nothing for political theory. She was devoted to Benito, managed his chaotic household, and tolerated his dark moods and frequent affairs with other women. In 1910, Rachel gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Etta. Though Mussolini refused to marry Rachel in a church, they lived together as husband and wife in a tiny, bare apartment in Forli. Mussolini's national breakthrough came in September 1911, when the Italian government, led by Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, declared war on the Ottoman Empire to conquer Libya. Most of Italy erupted in patriotic celebration, but the Italian Socialist Party firmly opposed the conflict as an imperialist war fought at the expense of working-class soldiers. In Forli, Mussolini became the national face of anti-war resistance. He did not merely protest. He organized an insurrection. He called for a general strike across Romagna, telling workers to sabotage railway tracks to prevent troop trains from carrying Italian soldiers to the ports. The national flag is a rag to be planted on a dunghill. Mussolini roared to a crowd of thousands in Forli. He urged the crowd to smash the military recruitment stations and overthrow the government. Violent riots broke out across the region. Workers tore up telegraph wires, blocked trains with wooden carts, and fought pitched battles with the national police. Mussolini was arrested at the center of the chaos. In September 1911, he was put on trial for inciting violence, destruction of public property, and treason. During his trial, Mussolini turned the courtroom into his personal stage. Instead of begging for mercy, he delivered a fiery speech defending his actions. "If you acquit me, you will do me a favor," he told the judges defiantly. "If you condemn me, you will do me an honor." He was convicted and sentenced to 5 months in prison. When Mussolini emerged from jail in March 1912, he was no longer just a regional agitator. He was a hero to the radical, revolutionary wing of the Italian Socialist Party. Italian workers saw him as a brave leader who was willing to go to prison for his beliefs. 4 months later, in July 1912, the Italian Socialist Party held its National Congress in the city of Reggio Emilia. The party was deeply divided between two factions: moderate reformists who wanted to work within the parliamentary system to improve workers' lives gradually, and radical revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow the state entirely. Mussolini dominated the Congress. Taking the stage with his broad chest pushed out and his eyes blazing, he launched a devastating verbal attack on the moderate leaders. He accused them of selling out the working class to the king and the capitalists, his speech electrifying the young radicals in the audience. Moved by Mussolini's charismatic performance, the Congress voted to expel the moderate leaders from the party. The radical wing took complete control of the Italian Socialist Party, and Mussolini was recognized as its undisputed rising star. As a reward for his dramatic triumph at Reggio Emilia, the party leadership handed Mussolini the most powerful position in Italian left-wing politics: the editorship of Avanti, Forward, the official national daily newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party. In December 1912, 29-year-old Benito Mussolini arrived in Milan, the industrial capital of Italy, to take control of Avanti. It was a massive leap from writing small regional newsletters in Forli to directing the national voice of Italian socialism. Mussolini transformed Avanti overnight. He threw out the boring, academic articles written by elderly socialist theorists and replaced them with sensational headline-driven journalism. He reduced the length of articles, increased the use of bold print, and wrote front-page editorials that read like military orders. He focused on stories of police brutality, worker strikes, and economic injustice, presented with raw emotional intensity. The results were astonishing. Within 2 years under Mussolini's direction, the circulation of Avanti jumped from 20,000 copies a day to well over 100,000 copies. The paper became required reading not only for factory workers and farm hands, but also for politicians, business leaders, and police officials who wanted to know what the revolutionary left was planning. Mussolini became a celebrity across Italy. He moved through the streets of Milan wearing a dark coat, surrounded by admirers and young socialists who viewed him as the future dictator of the Italian working class. Even foreign revolutionaries took notice. Vladimir Lenin, the exiled Russian Bolshevik leader living in Switzerland, praised Mussolini as a dynamic, uncompromising leader who had the rare ability to lead the masses into battle. By the spring of 1914, Italy seemed to be sliding toward open revolution. Economic hardship, rising food prices, and worker discontent culminated in June 1914 in a week of widespread civil unrest known as Red Week, Settimana Rossa. The spark was fired on June 7, 1914 in the town of Ancona, when police fired on an anti-militarist demonstration, killing 3 protesters. From the offices of Avanti in Milan, Mussolini seized the moment. He issued a frantic call for a national general strike, using the front page of the paper to urge workers to rise up. For 7 days, northern and central Italy descended into chaos. Workers shut down factories, halted train traffic, and barricaded the streets of major cities. In Romagna and the March, radical crowds seized government buildings, burned churches, and proclaimed independent socialist republics. In Milan, Mussolini marched at the head of mass demonstrations, directly confronting police lines. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Italian state was on the verge of total collapse, and Benito Mussolini was directing the storm. However, the revolution lacked real organization. The moderate trade union leaders, terrified by the scale of the violence, called off the general strike after a few days. The Italian government deployed thousands of soldiers to restore order, clearing the barricades and arresting hundreds of rioters. By mid-June, Red Week had collapsed, leaving the radical left defeated and disappointed. Mussolini was furious. He blamed the failure of Red Week on the cowardice of the trade union leaders and the lack of military discipline among the working class. The experience left a deep mark on his thinking. He realized that mass enthusiasm alone was not enough to capture power. To overthrow a state, a political movement needed more than just angry crowds and fiery editorials. It needed military organization, ruthlessness, and an understanding of power that went far beyond traditional Marxist theories. Yet, despite the defeat of Red Week, Mussolini's position as the king of Italian socialist journalism remained intact. He was 31 years old, powerful, famous, and feared by the ruling establishment. He seemed destined to lead the Italian socialist movement into the future. Then, in August 1914, an assassin's bullet in Sarajevo set off World War I, unleashing a global crisis that would shatter the European political landscape, destroy old alliances, and transform Benito Mussolini from a Marxist editor into something entirely new and far more dangerous. In late July 1914, Europe collapsed into total war. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria had been assassinated in Sarajevo, setting off a chain reaction of military mobilizations across the continent. Within weeks, millions of soldiers were marching toward the battlefields of France, Belgium, and Russia. For the international socialist movement, the outbreak of World War I was a devastating disaster. For decades, socialist parties across Europe had sworn that working-class men would never fire on one another for the sake of kings, bankers, and imperialists. The official policy of the Socialist International was clear. If war broke out, workers in every country would stage a general strike and shut down their nations until the ruling classes were forced to make peace. Yet, as soon as the war drums began to beat, that internationalist unity vanished overnight. German socialists voted in favor of war credits to fight Tsarist Russia. French socialists rushed to defend their republic against Germany. British workers lined up at recruitment stations. Across Europe, loyalty to the nation immediately proved far stronger than loyalty to class. Italy was in a unique position. Although Italy was technically allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the Triple Alliance, the Italian government declared neutrality in August 1914. Prime Minister Antonio Salandra argued that the alliance was purely defensive, and since Austria had launched an unprovoked attack on Serbia, Italy was under no obligation to join the fighting. The Italian Socialist Party, SI, took a firm, unyielding stance in favor of Italian neutrality. Their slogan was simple and uncompromising: neither support nor sabotage. To the socialist leadership, World War I was a bloodbath cooked up by imperialist capitalists who wanted to sacrifice millions of peasant lives for territorial expansion. As the chief editor of Avanti, Benito Mussolini was initially required to enforce this official anti-war line. In August 1914, he wrote blistering front-page articles denouncing the war. He called on Italian workers to refuse to wear uniforms, and warned that any attempt by the Italian government to enter the war would be met with an immediate, violent revolution. However, behind his fierce anti-war editorials, Mussolini was undergoing a rapid and profound intellectual crisis. He watched with awe and frustration as the war reshaped the European continent. He saw how millions of ordinary men were willingly laying down their lives for their homelands. Nationalism was revealing itself to be the most powerful emotional force in modern human history, far more powerful than the dry economic theories of Karl Marx. Mussolini began to realize that if Italian socialists remained strictly neutral, sitting on the sidelines while the greatest conflict in history unfolded around them, the party would become irrelevant. Furthermore, Mussolini began to see the war not as a catastrophe, but as an unbelievable historical opportunity. Like the French philosopher Georges Sorel, Mussolini believed that real revolutionary change required a massive, violent crisis to shatter the existing order. A prolonged European war would destroy empires, bankrupt governments, and tear apart the social fabric of the continent. Out of that destruction, new revolutionary forces would rise. If Italy entered the war and helped defeat the autocratic German and Austro-Hungarian empires, the resulting crisis would destroy the weak Italian monarchy and pave the way for a revolutionary new society. By September 1914, Mussolini could no longer hide his changing beliefs. He began meeting secretly with groups of radical pro-war intellectuals, syndicalists, and futurists who called themselves interventionists. They argued that neutrality was a sign of national weakness and cowardice. On October 18, 1914, Mussolini published an article in Avanti that hit the Italian Socialist Party like a bomb. The title was carefully chosen, From Absolute Neutrality to Active and Operative Neutrality. In the article, Mussolini did not explicitly demand an immediate declaration of war, but he dropped a heavy question on the socialist movement. Could a true revolutionary party remain completely passive while the future of Europe was being decided on the battlefield? He argued that by holding onto an absolute, rigid stance of neutrality, the socialists were condemning themselves to political impotence. The reaction within the Socialist Party was immediate, furious, and unanimous. The leadership felt betrayed by their star editor. Workers and party members across Italy read the article in utter disbelief. The very man who had spent years preaching anti-militarism and leading anti-war riots was now opening the door to military intervention. 2 days later, on October 20, the executive committee of the Piazzale held an emergency meeting in Milan. Mussolini was called before the party bosses to explain himself. Refusing to apologize or back down, he defended his views with characteristic arrogance, insisting that a revolutionary must adapt to changing historical realities. The executive committee stripped him of his position as editor of Avanti. On the spot, Mussolini walked out of the newspaper's offices, unemployed and politically isolated, but he was far from defeated. He knew that to fight his former comrades, he needed his own voice. In less than a month, through sheer willpower and suspicious financial support, Mussolini created a brand new daily newspaper. On November 15, 1914, the first issue of Il Popolo d'Italia, The People of Italy, appeared on the newsstands of Milan. Where had a penniless, disgraced editor gotten the vast amount of money needed to set up a major daily newspaper so quickly? The source of the funding was a closely guarded secret at the time, but the truth eventually emerged. The money came from French government agents, wealthy Italian industrial leaders, and pro-war business figures. France was desperate to drag Italy into the war to open a southern front against Austria, and they were more than willing to pay a fiery radical journalist to sway Italian public opinion. On the front page of Il Popolo d'Italia, Mussolini placed 2 bold slogans that defined his new ideological direction. On the left, socialism is an idea that can be conquered. On the right, a quote from Napoleon Bonaparte, revolution is an idea which has found bayonets. In the newspaper's very first editorial, Mussolini severed his ties with his past once and for all. He abandoned class struggle and embraced the nation. He wrote, "Today I must shout out loud a terrifying and solemn word, war. The Italian workers must realize that their future is tied to the strength and victory of their nation." The final rupture between Mussolini and the Italian Socialist Party came on November 24, 1914, at a chaotic party assembly held in the Teatro del Popolo in Milan. When Mussolini stepped onto the stage to address the thousands of socialist workers packed into the theater, he was met with a deafening wall of hatred. The crowd screamed traitor, Judas, and get out. People threw coins, rotten fruit, and spit at him. Mussolini stood at the podium, pale with anger, his eyes burning with rage. He tried to speak over the roar of the crowd, smashing his fist onto the wooden lectern. When the noise made it impossible for him to be heard, he grabbed a glass, smashed it on the table, and held up the jagged stem. "You hate me today because you still love me," he shouted above the din. "You think you can cast me out, but you will not eliminate me. My hatred for your cowardice will follow you everywhere. I tell you that from this day on, I will show no mercy to anyone who lacks the courage to fight for the destiny of Italy." The assembly voted overwhelmingly to expel Benito Mussolini permanently from the Italian Socialist Party. He was cast out into the political wilderness, disowned by his father's movement, hated by his former friends, and viewed with deep suspicion by the conservative establishment. Yet, this expulsion was the defining turning point of his life. Free from the strict rules of Marxist ideology, Mussolini began assembling a new political coalition out of the chaos of the interventionist movement. Throughout the winter of 1914 and the spring of 1915, Italy was torn apart by intense political conflict. On one side stood the neutralists, the majority of the Italian people, including peasant farmers, Catholic organizations, and the Socialist Party, who wanted no part in the war. On the other side stood the interventionists, a loud, aggressive minority made up of nationalist intellectuals, university students, military officers, syndicalists, and radical journalists led by Mussolini and the famous nationalist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. Mussolini used Il Popolo d'Italia to whip the interventionist movement into a violent frenzy. He organized street demonstrations, led marches, and instructed his followers to attack anti-war socialist rallies with clubs and brass knuckles. He argued that the street belonged to those who were willing to spill blood for their ideas. By May 1915, the political crisis reached its boiling point during a period known as Radiant May, Maggio Radioso. Pro-war crowds swarmed the streets of Rome, Milan, and Turin, surrounded the parliament building, and threatened to murder neutralist politicians. Terrified by the threat of civil war, King Victor Emmanuel Roman III and his government yielded to the violent pressure of the streets. On May 23, 1915, Italy formally declared war on Austria-Hungary. Mussolini was overjoyed. He took total credit for driving Italy into the conflict, celebrating the declaration of war on the front page of Il Popolo d'Italia as a heroic victory for the new generation of Italian nationalists. The socialist schoolmaster from Dovia di Predapio had helped push an entire nation into the largest war in human history. Now, he had to face the reality of the bloody storm he had helped create. When Italy entered World War I in May 1915, its political leaders and military generals promised the nation a swift, glorious victory. They believed Italian armies would breach the Austro-Hungarian frontier, capture the city of Trieste, cross the Carso plateau, and march triumphantly toward Vienna within a few months. It was a total illusion. The Italian army was woefully unprepared for modern industrial warfare. It lacked heavy artillery, modern machine guns, proper medical supplies, and adequate winter clothing. Furthermore, the Italian commander-in-chief, General Luigi Cadorna, was a ruthless, cold-blooded commander who believed in outdated 19th-century tactics. Cadorna believed that sheer willpower and direct infantry charges against fortified enemy positions could win any battle, regardless of the human cost. The Italian front was geographically one of the most brutal fighting zones in Europe. The border ran through the rugged, icy peaks of the Alps and across the harsh, stony desert of the Carso Plateau near the Isonzo River. There were no soft fields of dirt to dig trenches into. The ground on the Carso was made of solid limestone rock. When Austrian artillery shells hit the ground, they did not just blast dirt into the air. They shattered the limestone, spraying thousands of razor-sharp stone splinters into the bodies of the advancing Italian soldiers. Benito Mussolini did not rush to the front immediately in May 1915. He continued to publish Il Popolo d'Italia for several months, arguing that his pen was a more powerful weapon for the war effort than a rifle. However, as public criticism grew from socialists who accused him of hiding behind his desk while working-class men died in the trenches, Mussolini knew he had to put on the uniform. In August 1915, 32-year-old Benito Mussolini was drafted into the Italian Royal Army. He was assigned to his old unit, the 11th Bersaglieri Regiment, and sent directly to the harsh, stone-strewn battlefields of the Carso. Mussolini's time as a frontline combat soldier lasted on and off for nearly 18 months, from September 1915 to February 1917. During this time, the former socialist draft dodger proved to be a reliable, obedient, and aggressive soldier. He lived in the damp, rat-infested trenches of the Carso, sharing the terrible daily realities of the frontline infantrymen. He endured freezing winter snow, scorching summer heat, blinding mud, dysentery, and the constant, deafening roar of enemy artillery. He saw thousands of his young countrymen torn apart by machine gun fire and buried in shallow, rocky graves. Unlike many intellectual interventionists who complained about the filth and misery of trench life, Mussolini embraced the brutal environment. He maintained a war diary, which was regularly published in installments by Il Popolo d'Italia. In these published entries, Mussolini carefully constructed the heroic image of himself as a tough, fearless soldier who loved his comrades and lived only for the glorious Italian nation. He wrote about the cold nights, the terrible food, and the thrill of incoming enemy fire with a grim, stoic pride. He praised the bravery of the ordinary Italian peasant soldiers, noting that while they knew little about political theory, they possessed a deep, uncomplaining capacity for sacrifice. Mussolini was promoted to corporal in February 1916 for exceptional merit on the battlefield. His military commanders noted in his official record that Corporal Mussolini was always the first in dangerous tasks, energetic, courageous, and steady under fire. Yet, behind his published war diary, Mussolini was carefully observing how the experience of total war was changing human psychology. In the trenches, social classes melted away. Workers, peasants, students, and aristocrats were all dressed in the same gray-green uniforms, eating the same bland rations, and facing the same sudden death. A new brotherhood was being forged in the mud and blood of the front lines, a brotherhood born not of class consciousness, but of shared violence, national survival, and mutual sacrifice. Mussolini called this new social reality the trenchocracy, trencherocrasia. He realized that when the war finally ended, these millions of battle-hardened veterans would return home transformed. They would no longer accept the old, corrupt parliamentary politics of the pre-war era. They would demand a new political system led by those who had bled for the country in the trenches. While Mussolini was fighting on the Carso, his personal life caught up with him in a strange and dramatic way. In late 1915, a woman named Ida Dalser appeared in Milan, claiming that she had secretly married Mussolini in 1914 and had given birth to his son, Benito Albino. Ida Dalser was a wealthy woman who had sold her beauty salon to help fund Mussolini's newspaper during his dark days of political expulsion. Terrified that a public scandal over bigamy would ruin his reputation as a national hero, Mussolini acted quickly. In December 1915, while home on sick leave with typhoid fever, he officially married his longtime common-law partner, Rachel Guidi, in a civil ceremony in a hospital in Treviso. Ida Dalser was pushed aside, ignored, and eventually subjected to intense police surveillance. Years later, when Mussolini took total power in Italy, he would have Ida Dalser and her son locked away in mental institutions to hide the truth of his past. Mussolini returned to the front lines after recovering from illness, continuing his service through the brutal battles of 1916. But his military career came to a sudden, violent end on February 23, 1917. Mussolini was stationed on a barren hill called Hill 143 on the Carso Plateau, participating in a target practice exercise with a heavy mortar unit. The mortar, an Italian-made trench weapon, was old and overheated after firing multiple rounds. Without warning, a mortar shell jammed inside the hot barrel and exploded. The blast was catastrophic. It killed 4 Italian soldiers instantly and severely wounded several others. Mussolini was hurled through the air by the force of the explosion, his body shredded by flying metal fragments and hot shrapnel. He was rushed to a nearby field hospital in a state of deep shock, covered in blood and groaning in pain. The military doctors counted over 40 pieces of hot shrapnel embedded deeply in his legs, groin, and torso. The next few weeks were a painful ordeal. Without modern antibiotics or sufficient pain medication, doctors had to cut out the jagged metal pieces one by one while Mussolini was conscious. He endured 27 painful surgical operations without crying out, gritting his teeth and staring at the hospital ceiling to demonstrate his physical toughness to the medical staff. Severe infections set in, and for several weeks, doctors feared he would die or lose both of his legs. Word of the famous interventionist editor's injury spread quickly across Italy. King Victor Emmanuel Roman III himself visited Mussolini's bedside at the military hospital in Reins to pay his respects to the wounded hero. The king praised Mussolini's courage and wished him a speedy recovery. Mussolini made sure that journalists captured the royal visit, using the moment to raise his political profile across the country. By August 1917, after months of agonizing recovery, Mussolini was discharged from the army as a disabled war veteran. He walked with a noticeable limp, his legs scarred and stiffened from his injuries, and he was no longer fit for active frontline service. He returned to Milan, traded his stained military uniform for a dark civilian suit, and took back his seat as chief editor of Il Popolo d'Italia. Mussolini returned to his newspaper desk at a moment of supreme national crisis. The war was turning into a total nightmare for Italy. In October 1917, a combined German and Austro-Hungarian force launched a massive surprise attack near the town of Loreto. The Italian lines collapsed completely. General Cadorna's brutal leadership had broken the spirit of his troops. Panic spread through the ranks, and over 300,000 Italian soldiers threw down their weapons, abandoned their artillery, and fled westward in a chaotic retreat. The enemy advanced over 70 miles into Italian territory, capturing thousands of prisoners and vast amounts of military equipment before the Italian army managed to establish a desperate defense along the Piave River, just miles from Venice. The disaster of Loreto brought Italy to the brink of complete military defeat and political collapse. The Italian Socialist Party celebrated the collapse, viewing it as proof that the war was a failure and urging workers to demand an immediate peace. Mussolini reacted to the disaster of Loreto with wild rage. Through Il Popolo d'Italia, he launched an aggressive campaign to keep the nation from surrendering. He called for ruthless emergency measures, summary executions for draft dodgers, the arrest of neutralist politicians, and total state control over the economy. He argued that defeatism was a form of treason that needed to be stamped out with iron discipline. "We must fight," Mussolini wrote day after day. "We must hold the line on the Piave. If we lose this war, Italy will cease to exist as a nation." His fiery national rhetoric resonated with a growing segment of Italian society. Disillusioned factory workers, terrified middle-class citizens, war veterans, and industrial leaders began reading Il Popolo d'Italia not just as a newspaper, but as a political compass in a storm. Over the next year, through massive national sacrifice and heavy assistance from British and French allies, the reorganized Italian army managed to hold the line along the Piave River. In October 1918, 1 year after the disaster of Loreto, the Italian army launched a successful counteroffensive, breaking through the exhausted Austro-Hungarian lines at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. On November 4, 1918, Austria-Hungary signed an armistice, ending the war on the Italian front. 1 week later, Germany surrendered, and World War I came to an end. Italy had won the war. Over 600,000 Italian soldiers were dead, nearly 1 million were wounded or disabled, and the national economy was devastated by massive debt and inflation. Benito Mussolini stood in his newspaper office in Milan, looking out at a nation that was victorious on paper, but ruined, exhausted, and deeply divided in reality. The great storm of war was over, but an even greater storm was about to begin. The wounded veteran was ready to seize his moment. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the people of Italy expected peace, prosperity, and national celebration. Instead, they walked straight into a national nightmare. The victory in World War I felt like a bitter defeat to millions of Italians. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando demanded the territories promised to Italy by the Allies in the secret Treaty of London in 1915, including the region of Istria and the Dalmatian coast. However, American President Woodrow Wilson rejected these demands, arguing that the territory should belong to the newly created Kingdom of Yugoslavia. When the Italian delegation left the conference in protest, the British and French simply divided Germany's former African colonies among themselves, leaving Italy with almost nothing to show for its massive loss of life. Across Italy, a bitter phrase echoed through the streets: the mutilated victory, la vittoria mutilata. The nationalist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio popularized the term, capturing the burning humiliation felt by hundreds of thousands of returning soldiers who believed their sacrifices had been cheated by weak politicians and arrogant foreign allies. At the same time, the Italian economy was crashing. Demobilization flooded the job market with over 2 million unemployed war veterans. Factories that had produced artillery shells and rifles shut down, laying off hundreds of thousands of workers. Inflation skyrocketed, making basic foods like bread and milk unaffordable for ordinary families. Inspired by the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, the Italian radical left seized upon this economic misery. The Italian Socialist Party, now dominated by extreme revolutionaries, called for the immediate overthrow of the monarchy and the creation of a Soviet-style dictatorship of the proletariat. The years 1919 and 1920 became known in Italian history as the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years. Across northern and central Italy, society seemed to be breaking down entirely. Industrial workers seized control of hundreds of factories in Milan, Turin, and Genoa, locking out the owners and forming armed Red Guards to defend the buildings. In the countryside, bands of poor landless peasants invaded the estates of wealthy landowners, burning farmhouses and driving off livestock. Railway workers went on strike, leaving trains rotting on the tracks, while postal and utility workers shut down communication networks. To make matters worse, returning war veterans were mocked and insulted in the streets by socialist crowds. Soldiers wearing their uniforms were spat upon, beaten, and called murderers by left-wing mobs who viewed the war as a crime against the working class. In the middle of this rising, red tide sat the weak parliamentary government in Rome. The liberal politicians, led by the aging Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, were helpless. They refused to use the army or police to restore order, hoping that if they waited long enough, the social unrest would simply exhaust itself. To the Italian middle class, shopkeepers, small business owners, wealthy landowners, and military veterans, It appeared that Italy was sliding into a bloody communist revolution, and nobody in power was willing to stop it. Benito Mussolini saw this atmosphere of terror and collapse as his ultimate political opportunity. On March 23, 1919, Mussolini held a political meeting in Milan that would change the course of 20th century history. He invited a strange, motley group of about 100 people to assemble in a meeting room provided by the Industrial and Commercial Alliance in Piazzale San Sepolcro. The crowd consisted of disillusioned war veterans, nationalist intellectuals, former left-wing syndicalists, futurist artists led by Filippo Tommaso Marinti, and elite commandos from the war known as the Arditi, the daring ones. The Arditi were particularly terrifying figures. During the war, these elite shock troops had been trained to cross no man's land armed only with hand grenades and daggers to clear enemy trenches. They wore black shirts, carried long combat knives in their belts, and looked at civilian life with total contempt. Mussolini addressed the small, intense crowd in Piazzale San Sepolcro, announcing the creation of a new political movement, the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, Italian squads of combat. The word fasci came from the ancient Roman symbol of authority, the fasces, a bundle of wooden rods tied around an axe. In ancient Rome, the bundle of rods represented strength through unity. A single stick is easy to snap, but a bundle bound tightly together cannot be broken. The axe in the center represented the state's absolute power to judge and punish. Mussolini's initial political program for the Fasci was a strange, chaotic mix of far-left economic demands and far-right aggressive nationalism. He called for the abolition of the Italian Senate, voting rights for women, an 8-hour workday, a heavy tax on war profits, and the confiscation of Catholic Church property. At the same time, he demanded the aggressive expansion of Italian territory and the total suppression of all anti-national forces. What truly defined the Fasci, however, was not its written platform, but its open embrace of political violence. Mussolini declared that his movement was not a political party, but an anti-party, an armed organization dedicated to destroying the socialist threat through direct physical action. Less than a month after the meeting in Piazzale San Sepolcro, the Blackshirts launched their first major attack. On April 15, 1919, a massive socialist general strike shut down the city of Milan. As a huge crowd of left-wing protesters marched through the streets, they encountered a group of Mussolini's Blackshirts, armed with heavy wooden clubs, iron bars, and pistols. A fierce street battle erupted. The Blackshirts, trained in military tactics and led by former Arditi commandos, brutally charged into the larger socialist crowd. The left-wing protesters panicked and scattered in terror. Flush with victory, the Blackshirts marched directly to the offices of Avanti, Mussolini's former newspaper. They smashed through the heavy wooden doors, beat the editorial staff, wrecked the expensive printing presses, and set the building on fire. Mussolini did not participate in the physical attack himself, but he watched the black smoke rising above Milan from his office at Il Popolo d'Italia. The destruction of Avanti was a powerful symbolic statement. The Blackshirts were ready to use unrestrained violence to purge Italy of socialism. Despite this early act of violence, Mussolini's new movement almost collapsed at its first political test. In November 1919, Italy held national parliamentary elections. Mussolini ran as a candidate in Milan, promising voters that the Fasci represented the heroic future of the nation. The election was an absolute humiliation for Mussolini. The Italian Socialist Party won a crushing victory across the country, capturing over 150 seats in parliament. In Milan, Mussolini's movement received a pathetic total of less than 5,000 votes out of nearly 270,000 cast. Not a single fascist was elected to parliament. His former socialist comrades celebrated his defeat with cruel joy. A crowd of socialists organized a mock funeral procession through the streets of Milan, carrying a wooden coffin with Mussolini's name painted on the side. They marched past his apartment building, singing funeral dirges and throwing dirt at his windows to signal that Benito Mussolini's political career was dead and buried. Even the local police thought Mussolini was finished. 2 days after the election, police raided the offices of Il Popolo d'Italia and arrested Mussolini after finding a small cache of weapons and hand grenades hidden in the building. He spent 24 hours in a jail cell before influential friends secured his release. It was the lowest point of his life since his wandering days in Switzerland. But Mussolini possessed an extraordinary ability to adapt when faced with total failure. He realized that his original political program had been a mistake. The working class was never going to choose his radical National Socialism over the traditional Italian Socialist Party. If he wanted power, he had to abandon his left-wing economic ideas entirely and appeal directly to a different audience: the terrified middle classes, wealthy landowners, and industrial capitalists who were desperate for someone to protect them from the Red threat. In 1920, Mussolini completely reshaped his movement, shifting it firmly to the political right. He dropped his demands for taxing wealth and confiscating church property. Instead, he presented the Fasces as the sole defenders of law, order, private property, and national pride. At the same time, the nature of fascist violence shifted from small-scale street brawls in big cities to organized paramilitary terror in the countryside. This phenomenon became known as squadrismo. Across the agricultural regions of Romagna, Emilia-Romagna, Tuscany, and the Po Valley, local fascist leaders, known as the Ras, a title borrowed from Ethiopian war chieftains, formed armed paramilitary squads. These squads were financed by wealthy local landowners who paid the Blackshirts to break the power of the socialist farm unions. The tactics of the squadristi were brutally effective. In the dead of night, groups of 20 to 30 Blackshirts would pile into open military trucks, armed with rifles, pistols, hand grenades, and wooden clubs wrapped in wire called manganelli. They would drive into small rural towns, target the homes of local socialist mayors, union leaders, or labor organizers, and kick down the doors. They beat the union leaders senseless in front of their wives and children, destroyed their furniture, and set fire to local labor headquarters. To humiliate their victims, the Blackshirts developed a cruel signature punishment. They forced captured socialist leaders to drink large quantities of castor oil, a powerful laxative, mixed with gasoline. The victims were then paraded through the town square in ruined clothes, suffering from severe internal cramps and uncontrolled diarrhea, while the Blackshirts laughed and sang nationalist songs. If a town resisted, the Blackshirts returned in greater numbers, burning down social clubs, seizing town halls, and murdering prominent left-wing figures. Between late 1920 and mid-1921, squadrismo systematically destroyed the Italian left-wing movement in rural Italy. Hundreds of socialist offices were burned to the ground. Dozens of local governments were forced to resign under threat of death, and hundreds of working-class activists were murdered. Where were the police and the state authorities during this campaign of terror? In almost every case, the police turned a blind eye or actively helped the Blackshirts. Army officers quietly supplied Mussolini's squads with surplus weapons, trucks, and ammunition. The conservative establishment viewed the Blackshirts as useful thugs who were doing the dirty work of cleaning up the communist threat, work that the weak liberal government in Rome was too cowardly to perform. Mussolini watched the sudden, explosive growth of Squadrismo with a mix of excitement and caution. He did not directly control every local squad. Powerful regional bosses like Italo Balbo in Ferrara, Roberto Farinacci in Cremona, and Dino Grandi in Bologna operated with near-total independence. However, Mussolini used his newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia to position himself as the supreme political mastermind and sole spokesman of the entire fascist movement. He warned the Italian government and the middle classes that if they wanted the Blackshirt violence to stop, they had to deal directly with him. By May 1921, Mussolini's political gamble paid off. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, believing he could tame the fascist movement by bringing it into the official political system, included Mussolini and his followers in a national political alliance for the upcoming parliamentary elections. The elections of May 1921 were a massive triumph for Mussolini. The Fasci Italiani di Combattimento won 35 seats in the Italian parliament. 2 years after his humiliating defeat in Milan, 37-year-old Benito Mussolini walked into the Palazzo Montecitorio in Rome as an elected member of parliament. He took his seat on the far right side of the chamber, surrounded by his black-shirted deputies. The penniless vagrant, the radical schoolmaster, and the wounded war veteran had fought his way into the heart of Italian power, and he had no intention of remaining just a member of parliament. He was already planning his final assault on the state. By the summer of 1922, Italy was a nation in name only. The weak democratic government in Rome had lost control of the country. In the streets and villages, the law was not enforced by the police or the courts, but by the iron clubs and pistols of Benito Mussolini's Blackshirts. In November 1921, Mussolini had formally transformed his violent movement into a structured political party, the Partito Nazionale Fascista, National Fascist Party, or PNF. Through this step, he aimed to tame the wildly radical regional warlords, the Ras, and present himself to the Italian establishment as a respectable political leader capable of restoring order. Yet, while Mussolini wore tailored suits in the halls of Parliament and spoke smoothly to journalists about constitutional stability, his paramilitary squads continued to unleash brutal violence across the peninsula. The Blackshirt campaign of 1922 was no longer just about attacking left-wing labor unions. It was a systematic military conquest of Italian cities. Under the leadership of aggressive Ras like Italo Balbo, armed fascist columns mobilized in military truck convoys and seized town after town. In Ferrara, Ravenna, and Bologna, thousands of Blackshirts occupied public squares, seized telegraph offices, forced anti-fascist mayors to flee under threat of execution, and burned down Union headquarters. The police and local army commanders stood by, either out of sympathy for the fascists or because they had received orders from Rome to avoid provoking bloodshed. In July 1922, the desperate anti-fascist labor unions called for a national general strike to force the government to suppress Blackshirt violence. It was a disastrous tactical mistake. Mussolini seized the moment instantly. He issued an ultimatum to the government. Either the state would stop the strike within 24 hours, or the fascists would do it themselves with total ruthlessness. When the government failed to act, the Blackshirts struck with devastating speed. In Milan, Genoa, Livorno, and Parma, armed squads attacked striking workers, commandeered streetcars to keep public transport running, and broke the strike by force within 48 hours. In Milan, Balbo's men stormed the historic town hall, ejected the elected socialist administration, and burned the offices of Avanti. For a third time, The total collapse of the general strike demonstrated two crucial facts to the Italian public. The left was completely broken, and the liberal government in Rome was useless. To the middle class, shopkeepers, industrial factory owners, and military leaders, Benito Mussolini appeared to be the only man in Italy capable of enforcing order and preventing anarchy. Mussolini watched the political landscape from his newspaper office at Il Popolo d'Italia in Milan. He knew that the time had come to make his ultimate move for total power. However, he faced a dangerous double challenge. On one side, his violent ras were growing impatient. Men like Italo Balbo and Roberto Farinacci warned Mussolini that if he did not order a direct armed march on Rome to overthrow the government, the Blackshirts would act without him. On the other side, the ruling establishment in Rome, including Prime Minister Luigi Facta and veteran politician Giovanni Giolitti, was trying to form a new coalition government and offered Mussolini a minor cabinet position, hoping to absorb him into the political system. Mussolini played a brilliant, double-faced game. He negotiated softly with politicians in Rome, pretending he was open to a peaceful, parliamentary solution, while secretly planning a violent coup d'etat with his military commanders. In late September 1922, Mussolini delivered a crucial speech in the southern city of Udine. To reassure the conservative establishment, he publicly dropped his long-standing opposition to the monarchy, declaring his loyalty to King Victor Emmanuel Roman III and praising the Italian royal army. At the same time, he sent a clear message to the nation. Our program is simple. We want to govern Italy. On October 24, 1922, the fascists held a massive party congress in Naples. Over 40,000 Blackshirts marched through the streets, chanting "Aroma, Aroma, to Rome, to Rome." Standing on the balcony before the roaring crowd, Mussolini declared, "Either the government will be given to us, or we shall seize it by marching on Rome." Behind closed doors at the Hotel Vesuvio in Naples that night, Mussolini and his top lieutenants finalized the operational plans for the insurrection. To lead the military operation, Mussolini appointed a committee of 4 loyal leaders known as the Quadriumvirs: Italo Balbo, the charismatic and ruthless Ras of Ferrara; Michele Bianchi, the secretary of the fascist party and a skilled political strategist; Emilio de Bono, a veteran army general who brought military credibility to the movement; Cesare Maria de Vecchi, a monarchist war veteran who maintained ties with the royal court. The plan was set for October 28, 1922. Fascist squads across Italy were ordered to seize key infrastructure, telegraph offices, police stations, railway hubs, and post offices in their respective regions. Simultaneously, 3 major columns of Blackshirts, totaling roughly 30,000 men, would converge on the capital from Santa Marinella, Monterotondo, and Tivoli, surrounding Rome and forcing the government to surrender. While his quadriumvirs headed to Perugia to set up the military headquarters for the march, Benito Mussolini did something unexpected. He boarded a train and went back to Milan, over 400 miles away from Rome. This was a calculated, cautious move. Mussolini was a political gambler, but he was also a realist. He knew that his Blackshirt squads were poorly equipped. They had rifles, hunting shotguns, clubs, and pistols, but they lacked heavy artillery, ammunition, and basic provisions. If the professional Italian Royal Army stationed in Rome was ordered to open fire, the Blackshirt columns would be smashed in hours. By remaining in Milan, close to the Swiss border, Mussolini kept a safe escape route open if the coup failed. If it succeeded, he could claim total victory. On the night of October 27, the insurrection began. Across northern and central Italy, Blackshirts mobilized in the pouring rain. They seized telephone exchanges, cut telegraph lines, and took control of railway stations. By the morning of October 28, news reached Rome that thousands of armed fascists were boarding trains and marching toward the capital. In Rome, Prime Minister Luigi Facta finally realized the gravity of the threat. He called an emergency cabinet meeting at dawn on October 28. The cabinet agreed unanimously to take decisive action. Facta drafted a decree declaring a state of siege, stato d'assedio, which would place Italy under martial law, hand authority over to the military, and order the army to block all roads into Rome and shoot any armed insurrectionists who refused to disperse. General Publius, the military commander in charge of defending Rome, had nearly 30,000 loyal, well-equipped regular soldiers, backed by armored cars and artillery. He assured the government that his men could easily crush the poorly armed, wet, and hungry Blackshirt columns shivering in the mud outside the city walls. At 8:30 a.m. on October 28, Prime Minister Facta rushed to the Quirinal Palace to present the martial law decree to King Victor Emmanuel Roman III for his official signature. Without the king's signature, martial law could not legally take effect. What happened next in the king's private study changed the history of Europe. King Victor Emmanuel Roman III was a small, quiet, deeply insecure man. He was terrified of two things: a bloody civil war that might destroy the country, and the possibility that his cousin, the Duke of Aosta, who was openly sympathetic to Mussolini, might try to steal his crown if he ordered the army to fight the Blackshirts. Furthermore, the king doubted whether his own soldiers would actually obey orders to shoot war veterans wearing Blackshirt uniforms. The king stared at the martial law document, hesitated, and ultimately refused to sign it. Prime Minister Facta was stunned. Without the king's signature, the government was helpless. Facta had no choice but to hand in his resignation. The state of siege was revoked, and news spread rapidly across Italy that the army would not fight the fascists. The barrier standing between Mussolini and total power had vanished. In Milan, Mussolini waited by the telephone in his office at Il Popolo d'Italia, keeping a loaded pistol on his desk. On the afternoon of October 29, the telephone rang. It was a call from the Quirinal Palace in Rome. The king had given up trying to form a coalition government with traditional politicians. He was inviting Benito Mussolini to come to Rome immediately to form a new cabinet as Prime Minister of Italy. Mussolini refused to rely on a mere verbal message. He demanded a formal telegram from the king before he would leave Milan. When the official telegram arrived, confirming his appointment, Mussolini smiled at his staff, put on his coat, and walked out of the building. On the evening of October 29, Mussolini boarded the night express train from Milan to Rome. He traveled not as a triumphant military commander at the head of a conquering army, but as a comfortable first-class passenger. He arrived at the Rome station on the morning of October 30, 1922. Dressed in a black shirt, a bowler hat, and a borrowed morning coat, he went straight to the Quirinal Palace to meet the king. Walking into the royal presence, the 39-year-old former draft dodger bowing before the monarch uttered a line carefully prepared for the history books. "Sire, I bring you the Italy of Vittorio Veneto, reconquered by the victory. I apologize for presenting myself in my black shirt, coming as I do from the battle which fortunately was bloodless." That afternoon, King Victor Emmanuel Roman III officially appointed Benito Mussolini as the 14th Prime Minister of Italy. At 39, he was the youngest man ever to hold the title in Italian history. Only after Mussolini had legally secured the premiership did the actual march on Rome take place. On October 31, under a bright autumn sun, roughly 25,000 wet, Muddy and exhausted Blackshirts were allowed to enter the capital. They paraded through the streets of Rome before the king and their new prime minister, cheering, singing fascist anthems, and waving their clubs before boarding special trains arranged by the government to carry them back home. The legend of the March on Rome was instantly manufactured by fascist propaganda. In the official myth, a heroic, bloodless revolution led by Duce had overthrown a corrupt democracy and saved the nation from communism. The reality was far more cynical. Benito Mussolini had won power through a combination of political terrorism, bluff, and the cowardice of a monarch who was too weak to defend his own constitution. Mussolini was now prime minister, but he was not yet an absolute dictator. He headed a coalition cabinet that included liberals, conservatives, Catholics, and military officers, while the fascists held only a small minority of seats in parliament. Yet, as he walked into the Palazzo Chigi to take control of the government, Mussolini knew that he had passed the point of no return. He had no intention of being a normal prime minister. He had reached the top of the Italian state, and he was ready to transform a parliamentary republic into a total dictatorship. When Benito Mussolini stepped into the office of prime minister in November 1922, he did not possess absolute authority. The Italian constitution was still in place, the press was still relatively free, and parliament was filled with political opponents who viewed him as a temporary aberration. Most established politicians believed they could tame the 39-year-old political agitator, allowing him to restore order before nudging him aside. They badly underestimated their new leader. Mussolini knew that his appointment was only the beginning of his struggle for absolute control. He ruled at the head of a coalition government that included liberals, right-wing nationalists, and members of the Catholic Popular Party. Out of 535 seats in the Chamber of Deputies, the Fascist Party held just 35. To cement his power, Mussolini needed to dismantle the democratic system from within, using the very mechanisms of parliament to destroy parliamentary rule. His first major test came on November 16, 1922, when he presented his new cabinet to the Chamber of Deputies. Dressed in a formal coat, Mussolini addressed the quiet, anxious room with open contempt. In what became known as the bivouac speech, he made his intentions clear to the elected representatives. I could have turned this gray, dull hall into a bivouac for my Blackshirts. I could have barred Parliament and formed a government composed exclusively of fascists. I could have, but I have not, at least not for the present. Instead of provoking outrage, the speech intimidated the deputies. The traditional politicians, eager to avoid violence and restore economic stability, voted overwhelmingly to grant Mussolini full emergency powers for 1 year. This decision allowed him to enact sweeping administrative and economic reforms by decree, bypassing parliamentary debate entirely. Mussolini moved quickly to institutionalize his power. In December 1922, he created the Fascist Grand Council, Gran Consiglio del Fascismo. Ostensibly a party organ, this body was designed to make policy decisions above the head of the official government cabinet, placing political initiative firmly inside the fascist movement. Shortly after, in January 1923, he took another critical step by converting the violent Blackshirt street squads into an official state organ, the Voluntary Militia for National Security, Milizia Volontaria per la Sicurezza Nazionale, or MVSN. By making the Blackshirts state employees paid out of the public treasury, Mussolini achieved two things at once. He satisfied his radical base by giving them official status, and he gave himself a private army answerable only to him, completely separate from the royal army. While securing control over the state apparatus, Mussolini worked to weaken his political opposition. He reached out to conservative institutions to isolate the left. To win over the Catholic Church, he introduced mandatory religious instruction in primary schools, placed crucifixes in classrooms and courtrooms, and raised the salaries of priests. These moves caused a rift within the Catholic Popular Party, Partito Popolare Italiano, forcing its anti-fascist leader, Luigi Sturzo, to resign under pressure from the Vatican. Meanwhile, Mussolini placated industrial bosses and landowners by cutting taxes on business profits, privatizing telephone networks, and outlawing strikes. Despite these tactical victories, Mussolini remained bound by democratic elections. His one-year emergency powers were set to expire late in 1923, and he needed a permanent majority in parliament to ensure his control. To achieve this, he tasked Giacomo Acerbo, his Undersecretary of State, with drafting a radical new electoral law. The Acerbo Law, introduced in the summer of 1923, was designed to eliminate the need for political coalitions. Under its terms, any single party or coalition list that won a simple plurality of the national vote, provided it achieved at least 25%, would automatically be granted 2/3, 66% of all seats in the Chamber of Deputies. The remaining third of the seats would be divided proportionally among all other opposition parties. It was a complete perversion of democratic representation, designed to hand total legislative control to whichever party finished first. Liberal politicians like Giovanni Giolitti and Antonio Salandra supported the bill, foolishly believing that a guaranteed fascist majority would stabilize the country and force Mussolini to operate within constitutional norms. The Acerbo Law passed Parliament in November 1923 by a wide margin. With the legal framework in place, Mussolini dissolved Parliament and called for a general election in April 1924. What followed was one of the most violent and corrupt election campaigns in Italian history. The fascists formed a unified national candidate list, known as the Listone, Big List, which included fascist candidates alongside accommodating liberals and conservatives. Opposite them, the opposition parties were hopelessly divided, running separate lists of socialists, communists, Republicans, and Catholics. During the campaign, Blackshirt militia forces systematically intimidated anti-fascist candidates and voters. Opposition newspapers were confiscated, campaign rallies were broken up by force, and prominent critics were beaten. In many rural districts, militia members stood inside voting booths to inspect marked ballots, while in other areas, election boxes were stuffed with fake votes. When the results were announced, the outcome was overwhelming. The Listone won 64.9% of the popular vote, securing 374 seats in the Chamber of Deputies, far exceeding the 2/3 majority required by the Acerbo Law. Mussolini now controlled Parliament, but the blatant corruption of the process sparked deep resentment across the country. On May 30, 1924, the newly elected Parliament convened in Rome. The atmosphere was tense as deputy after deputy took their seats. Then, a 38-year-old socialist representative named Giacomo Matteotti stood up to speak. Matteotti, the leader of the Unitary Socialist Party, was a brave, stubborn man who had spent months collecting detailed evidence of fascist electoral fraud and violence. For over 2 hours, despite deafening shouts, threats, and insults from the fascist benches, Matteotti delivered a scathing, meticulous speech. He documented specific instances of voter intimidation, ballot tampering, and assault across Italy. He argued that the election was a sham, that the government had violated the Constitution, and that the results should be formally annulled. As he finished his speech and sat down among his cheering colleagues, Matteotti turned to the deputy beside him and whispered quietly, "Now you can prepare the funeral speech for me." Mussolini was furious. Matteotti's speech was translated and printed in newspapers across Europe, damaging the image of moderation Mussolini had worked hard to build internationally. Moreover, Matteotti was preparing to deliver another speech a few days later, in which he promised to expose widespread financial corruption within the fascist government involving oil concessions granted to American firms. On the afternoon of June 10, 1924, Giacomo Matteotti was walking along the banks of the Tiber River in Rome on his way to the Parliamentary Library. A dark car pulled up beside him. 5 men jumped out, grabbed him, and dragged him kicking and screaming into the vehicle. Inside the moving car, a violent struggle broke out. Matteotti fought back fiercely against his attackers, but he was repeatedly stabbed with an iron file and killed. The assassins drove out into the countryside and buried his body in a shallow grave in a wooded area called the Quartiera, 14 miles north of Rome. When Matteotti failed to appear in Parliament that evening, rumors began to circulate. Within 24 hours, the news of his kidnapping leaked to the press, sending shockwaves through Italian society. The murder of a prominent parliamentary deputy went far beyond the routine street violence of previous years. It struck at the heart of the state. The police rapidly identified the car used in the abduction, which led directly to the chief culprits. The killers were members of the Secca, a secret fascist terror squad set up within the Prime Minister's press office. The squad was led by Amerigo Dumini, a ruthless fascist thug, and reported directly to Mussolini's close personal aides, including his press secretary Cesare Rossi and chief of police Emilio de Bono. The Matteotti crisis was the most dangerous moment of Benito Mussolini's political life. Public outrage exploded. Thousands of citizens took to the streets in silent protests, wearing red carnations in their buttonholes. Anti-fascist newspapers published detailed evidence linking the Prime Minister's immediate circle to the crime. Moderate politicians who had supported Mussolini began to distance themselves, and many Blackshirts hid their uniforms to avoid public anger. Mussolini panicked. He broke down in tears in front of visitors, suffered severe stomach pains from stress, and fired his closest aides, including Rossi and de Bono, in an effort to save himself. Amerigo Dumini and the assassins were arrested, though Dumini quietly warned his superiors that if he was abandoned, he would speak to the prosecutors. The opposition parties had a clear opportunity to bring down the government. On June 27, 1924, around 150 anti-fascist deputies, led by socialist Giovanni Amendola, walked out of the Chamber of Deputies in protest. They declared that they would not return to Parliament as long as Mussolini remained in power, taking refuge on an abstract moral high ground in an action known as the Aventine Secession, named after a historic protest in ancient Rome. However, the Aventine Secession proved to be a fatal strategic error. By walking out of Parliament, the opposition deputies voluntarily gave up their legislative power and abandoned the floor of the chamber. They hoped that their moral protest would force King Victor Emmanuel Roman III to exercise his constitutional authority, dismiss Mussolini as prime minister, and order new elections. The king refused to act. Victor Emmanuel Roman III was terrified of the alternatives. He feared that removing Mussolini would lead to widespread violent revenge by the Blackshirts, potentially triggering a civil war or opening the door to a left-wing revolution. Whenever anti-fascist leaders presented him with evidence linking Mussolini to the murder, the king dismissed them, stating that he was neutral and could not act unless Parliament passed a formal vote of no confidence, a vote that was impossible now that the opposition had walked out. For 6 months, the crisis dragged on in a tense stalemate. Mussolini remained cautious, speaking softly and promising to restore constitutional order. But by late autumn 1924, his radical supporters grew impatient with his defensive posture. In December 1924, the situation reached a breaking point. On August 16, Matteotti's decomposed body had finally been discovered, renewing public anger. In late December, anti-fascist newspapers published a secret memorandum written by Mussolini's former press secretary, Cesare Rossi, which explicitly detailed how Mussolini had personally ordered numerous acts of political violence. The radical fascist squad leaders, RAs, decided that Mussolini had waited long enough. On December 31, 1924, a delegation of 30 senior militia commanders, led by Italo Balbo and Enzo Galbiati, marched into Mussolini's office. They presented their leader with an ultimatum. Either he would crush the opposition, end the parliamentary crisis, and establish a total dictatorship, or they would remove him from leadership and launch a full-scale armed revolution themselves. Mussolini realized that his hesitation was costing him the support of his own movement. Forced to choose between total ruin or total dictatorship, he chose total dictatorship. On the afternoon of January 3, 1925, Mussolini walked into the Chamber of Deputies to deliver the most decisive speech of his political career. The hall was half empty, as the Aventine opposition deputies were still absent. Dressed in dark clothes, his face rigid, Mussolini stood before the remaining assembly and threw down the gauntlet to his critics and the nation. He began by reviewing the turbulent events of the previous 6 months, denying any personal involvement in the physical murder of Matteotti, but then he made a bold statement that shattered the Italian state. I declare before this assembly, and before the entire Italian people, that I, and I alone, assume the political, moral, and historical responsibility for everything that has happened. If fascism has been nothing more than castor oil and clubs, if it has been a criminal association, then I am the chief of this criminal association. Mussolini defied his opponents to impeach him, knowing they lacked the courage and the votes to do so. He warned the nation that the period of compromise was over and that force would now be answered with force. Italy, gentlemen, wants peace, quiet, and work. We shall give her this peace and quiet through love if possible, or by force if necessary. The speech of January 3, 1925, marked the official death of Italian democracy and the birth of the fascist dictatorship. Within 48 hours of the speech, Mussolini unleashed a wave of total repression across Italy. He ordered his Minister of the Interior to shut down all opposition political clubs and offices. Anti-fascist newspapers like La Stampa and Corriere della Sera were placed under strict state censorship or turned over to fascist editors. Police raided the homes of suspected political dissidents, arresting thousands without warrants. The Aventine deputies who tried to return to Parliament were barred from entering the building and formally stripped of their mandates. Over the next 2 years, between 1925 and 1926, Mussolini's government enacted a series of draconian measures known as the Exceptional Laws, Leggi Fascistissime, drafted by his legal advisor Alfredo Rocco. These laws systematically dismantled the democratic constitution step by step. Executive dominance. The prime minister was transformed into the head of the government, capo del governo, answerable only to the king, not to Parliament. Parliament lost the power to initiate laws or debate government policies without Mussolini's permission. Abolition of political parties. All political parties other than the National Fascist Party were officially banned. Italy became a one-party state. Destruction of local democracy. Elected mayors and municipal councils were abolished in every city and replaced by appointed officials called podesta, who reported directly to the central government in Rome. Total press control. Free journalism was eliminated. All journalists were required to join a fascist-controlled professional association to work legally. Political police and courts. A secret police force, the Avra Opera Volontaria per la Repressione dell'Antifascismo, was established to spy on citizens, intercept mail, and infiltrate underground organizations. A special tribunal for the defense of the state was created to try political crimes, introducing harsh prison sentences, and reinstating the death penalty for attempts against the leader's life. Mussolini was no longer just the head of a political cabinet. He was Il Duce, the undisputed leader of the Italian state. Through a mixture of political maneuvering, violence, and the fatal hesitation of his democratic rivals, Benito Mussolini had transformed himself from a parliamentary prime minister into the world's first fascist dictator. By the late 1920s, Benito Mussolini had successfully dismantled the democratic institutions of Italy. Opposition political parties were banned, independent labor unions were destroyed, and the press was placed under rigid state control. Yet, Mussolini understood that force alone could not maintain a total dictatorship indefinitely. To build a regime that would last for generations, he needed to capture the minds, hearts, and imaginations of the Italian people. He needed to turn a fragmented nation into a disciplined, unified force dedicated entirely to his vision. To achieve this, the regime created a massive, all-encompassing cult of personality centered on the heroic figure of Il Duce, the leader. In the new fascist Italy, Benito Mussolini was no longer portrayed as an ordinary politician or a mere government official. Propaganda painted him as a mythic figure, a political genius, and an infallible modern Caesar destined to restore Italy to the grandeur of the ancient Roman Empire. His face appeared everywhere, on poster walls in bustling cities, on painted brick facades of village farmhouses, on postage stamps, notebooks, coin currency, and school textbook covers. The famous slogan of the regime, repeated endlessly in speeches and broadcasts, left no room for doubt. Mussolini ha sempre ragione, Mussolini is always right. The press office, expanded into the Ministry of Popular Culture, Ministero della Cultura Popolare, or Min Cul Pop, controlled every word printed or broadcast in the country. Daily directives were issued to editors, detailing exactly how stories must be reported. Newspapers were forbidden from printing photos of Mussolini looking tired, wearing glasses, or celebrating a birthday, as Il Duce was required to appear eternally youthful, vigorous, and immortal. News of crimes, natural disasters, or economic hardship was strictly suppressed to create the illusion of a harmonious, orderly society under fascist rule. Mussolini staged his leadership as a dramatic performance. He mastered the art of public spectacle, using architecture, music, and body language to mesmerize crowds. His primary stage was the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in the center of Rome. Before massive crowds packing the piazza below, Mussolini would step onto the balcony in his black uniform, stand with his arms folded across his chest, jaw thrust forward, and eyes scanning the sea of people. He spoke in sharp, rhythmic sentences, using dynamic hand gestures and deep pauses, coaxing loud responses from the crowd like a conductor leading an orchestra. The propaganda machine carefully cultivated image profiles to appeal to every segment of Italian society. To intellectuals and professionals, he was portrayed as a tireless scholar who read classical literature, spoke multiple languages, and worked long into the night at his vast desk in the Palazzo Venezia, where the lights were intentionally left burning all night long to suggest he never slept. To factory workers and peasants, he was presented as a man of the people who knew the dignity of hard labor. Cameras filmed him stripped to the waist, working alongside farmers threshing wheat in the fields during his famous battle for grain. To the youth, he was depicted as a fearless sportsman, an expert horseman, speedboat driver, pilot, and fencer. To ensure the survival of his totalitarian vision, Mussolini targeted the youth of Italy. The regime recognized that while older generations might harbor quiet doubts about fascism, children could be completely molded from birth. In 1926, the state created the Opera Nazionale Balilla Anb, a compulsory youth organization that absorbed almost all boys and girls between the ages of 6 and 18. Boys were organized by age groups: the Figli della Lupa, children of the she-wolf, from ages 6 to 8, the Balilla from 8 to 14, and the Avanguardisti from 14 to 18. They wore black shirts and military caps, took oaths of loyalty to Duce, marched in formation, practiced rifle drills with scaled-down wooden weapons, and spent summers in regimented outdoor camps. Girls were placed in parallel organizations like the Piccole Italian, where they were taught physical fitness alongside domestic skills, explicitly preparing them for their designated roles as prolific mothers and wives for the fascist state. Education in public schools was totally overhauled. Textbooks were rewritten to emphasize Italian nationalist triumphs, the glorious history of Rome, and the achievements of the fascist revolution. Schoolchildren began their days by saluting the portrait of Mussolini hanging beside the crucifix, reciting prayers for the leader's safety, and writing essays praising his wisdom. Independent youth movements, including the Boy Scouts, were outlawed to eliminate any competing influences. While indoctrinating the young, Mussolini worked to remold Italian society through broad social engineering programs and public works. He launched a series of high-profile battles aimed at achieving economic self-sufficiency, autarky. The battle for grain, Battaglia del Grano, launched in 1925, was designed to make Italy entirely self-sufficient in wheat production, freeing the nation from foreign imports. High tariffs were placed on foreign grain, and farmers were pressured to convert fruit orchards and olive groves into wheat fields. While the initiative succeeded in dramatically boosting grain production and earning Mussolini international praise, it had costly side effects. It disrupted specialized agriculture, damaged the export trade in wine and citrus fruits, and increased food costs for average consumers. Simultaneously, Mussolini declared the battle for land, Battaglia della Terra. The crowning achievement of this initiative was the draining of the Pontine Marshes, a vast, swampy, malaria-infested region south of Rome that had remained uninhabitable since antiquity. Thousands of unemployed workers were deployed to dig drainage canals, clear brush, and construct roads. Within a few years, the lethal swamps were transformed into fertile farmland, dotted with thousands of modern farmhouses and brand-new model cities such as Littoria, now Latina, and Sabaudia. This genuine engineering triumph provided dramatic propaganda footage that was shown in newsreels across the world, reinforcing the image of Duce as a leader who could conquer nature itself. To address Italy's persistent demographic weakness compared to powers like Germany and France, Mussolini announced the battle for births, Battaglia per la Nascite, in 1927. He declared that a nation's power was directly tied to its population size, setting a goal to boost Italy's population from 40 million to 60 million. The state introduced heavy taxes on bachelors, granted tax exemptions and loans to large families, and awarded medals to women who bore many children. Contraception was strictly banned, and women were systematically pushed out of professional jobs to encourage domestic life. Despite these coercive measures, the campaign failed. Economic pressure caused the national birth rate to fall steadily throughout the 1930s. For all these domestic programs, Mussolini faced one ancient, unresolved problem that had threatened every Italian government since the unification of the country in 1861: the Roman question, the deep conflict between the Italian state and the Roman Catholic Church. Ever since Italian troops captured Rome in 1870 and ended the temporal power of the papacy, successive popes had declared themselves prisoners in the Vatican, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the Kingdom of Italy. This rift forced millions of devout Italian Catholics to choose between their religious faith and their national identity. Mussolini, though a lifelong atheist who had written anti-clerical tracts in his youth, recognized that resolving this decades-old feud would bring him immense prestige at home and abroad. Negotiations between the fascist regime and the Vatican were conducted secretly over 3 years. On February 11, 1929, inside the Lateran Palace in Rome, Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, representing Pope Pius Roman XI, and Benito Mussolini signed the historic Lateran Pacts. The agreements consisted of 3 distinct documents: a political treaty. Italy officially recognized the full sovereignty of the Holy See over a newly created independent state, Vatican City State, covering 109 acres in the heart of Rome. In return, the Pope formally recognized the Kingdom of Italy with Rome as its capital. A financial convention. The Italian government paid the Vatican a massive sum in cash and government bonds as financial compensation for the loss of the Papal States in 1870. A concordat. This document defined the official status of the Catholic religion within Italy. Catholicism was declared the sole religion of the state. Religious instruction was made mandatory in secondary schools. Church marriages were granted full legal validity, and strict laws against divorce were upheld. The Lateran Pacts were a sensational triumph for Mussolini. Pope Pius Roman XI publicly referred to Duce as a man sent by Providence, giving the fascist dictator unprecedented moral legitimacy among conservative Catholics worldwide. The treaty eliminated the largest potential source of internal opposition to his regime and elevated Mussolini's global standing. Foreign statesmen, including Winston Churchill in Britain, praised Mussolini as a brilliant leader who had brought stability and peace to Italy. Underneath the polished surface of propaganda, public works, and diplomatic victories, everyday life in fascist Italy was strictly regimented. To control the adult working population, the regime created the Opera Nazionale dopo lavoro and, or National After-Work Organization. The dopo lavoro established a vast network of community clubs, sports facilities, libraries, movie theaters, and travel groups across the country. It offered workers discounted tickets to concerts and theaters, organized subsidized beach holidays for poor families, and arranged sports leagues. While the dopo lavoro was immensely popular, it served a clear political purpose. By controlling leisure time, the state ensured that citizens spent their off-work hours within organized fascist environments, leaving little room for private discussion, independent unionizing, or political dissent. The physical appearance of Italian towns was also altered to reflect the ideology of the regime. Mussolini sought to forge a visual link between his dictatorship and the monumental heritage of ancient Rome. He launched massive architectural projects that reshaped the capital. Historic medieval neighborhoods surrounding the Colosseum and the Roman Forum were demolished to build the Via dell'Impero Avenue of the Empire, a vast parade street designed for military marches. Architects developed a distinct fascist style, a blend of classical Roman arches, columns, and modern, stark rationalist architecture. Buildings were lined with white marble, inscribed with quotes from Mussolini's speeches, and adorned with the fasces, the ancient Roman symbol of authority consisting of a bundle of wooden rods tied around an axe. Massive sporting complexes, such as the Foro Mussolini, now the Foro Italico, were built, dominated by giant marble statues of athletic heroes and a giant monolith bearing the dictator's name. By 1930, the cult of personality appeared complete. Mussolini held total executive control, serving simultaneously as prime minister and head of up to 8 government ministries at once, including the ministries of Interior, Foreign Affairs, and the Armed Forces. He had created an environment where independent thought was erased, and critical feedback was treated as treason. Yet, this total concentration of power contained the seeds of ultimate disaster. Surrounding himself with fawning sycophants who told him only what he wanted to hear, Mussolini gradually began to believe his own propaganda. He came to believe that he was indeed a genius of military and political strategy, that the Italian people were entirely unified behind his vision, and that his armed forces were a formidable war machine. As the decade turned, Duce grew bored with the quiet routines of domestic administration and economic battles. His eyes turned outward, away from internal development toward foreign conquest. The dictator who had remade Italy in his own image was now determined to carve out a new Roman Empire on the global stage, setting his nation on a path toward catastrophic war. By 1934, Benito Mussolini had reached the absolute peak of his domestic power. The Italian state was firmly under his control, the Vatican had been placated, and the cult of Duce was operating at full capacity. Yet, inside the grand halls of the Palazzo Venezia, the dictator was growing restless. Mussolini did not view fascism merely as a domestic political system. He viewed it as a warrior movement destined to transform Italians into a martial race. In his mind, true national greatness could not be measured by drained swamps or increased grain yields, but only by the conquest of foreign lands and the creation of a vast new Roman Empire. Mussolini looked across the Mediterranean toward East Africa. For decades, the African continent had been carved up by European powers. Italy, joining the colonial race late in the 19th century, had been left with only 2 barren stretches of land, Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. Worse still, in 1896, an Italian army had suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Adwa against the forces of Emperor Menelik Roman II of Ethiopia, then known to Europeans as Abyssinia. It was the worst defeat ever suffered by a European power against an African nation in modern history. The stain of Adwa sat like a heavy shadow over Italian military pride, and Mussolini was determined to wipe it off the map. Ethiopia was the last remaining major independent African empire, a proud nation ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie and a founding member of the League of Nations. To Mussolini, it was the perfect target. Conquest would link Italy's existing colonies of Eritrea and Somaliland, create an East African empire, provide land for Italian settlers, and demonstrate to the world that fascist Italy was a premier military power. The pretext for war was engineered in December 1934 at Walwal, an obscure desert oasis located inside Ethiopian territory near the ill-defined border with Italian Somaliland. Italian troops had erected a fortified post at the oasis. When Ethiopian border guards arrived to reclaim the area, a tense standoff erupted into a bloody firefight that left over 100 Ethiopian soldiers and 50 Italian colonial troops dead. Mussolini seized on the Walwal incident immediately. Instead of seeking a diplomatic solution through arbitration, he demanded an official apology and astronomical financial reparations from the Ethiopian government. Emperor Haile Selassie appealed directly to the League of Nations in Geneva, begging the international body to intervene and preserve peace. But Mussolini had already made up his mind. He was not interested in compensation. He wanted war. Throughout the spring and summer of 1935, Italy prepared for war on a scale never before seen in East Africa. Mussolini poured vast sums from the Italian treasury into building ports, roads, airfields, and military bases in Eritrea and Somaliland. Hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers, Blackshirt militia units, and African colonial troops Ascaris were packed onto transport ships and sent through the Suez Canal. The British and French governments, who held the keys to European diplomacy, watched the military buildup with growing alarm. They desperately wanted to prevent Mussolini from forming an alliance with Adolf Hitler, who had taken power in Germany 2 years earlier and was rapidly rearming. Hoping to keep Italy on their side in Europe, London and Paris engaged in a policy of weak appeasement. They offered Mussolini economic concessions in Africa if he would drop his war plans, but Duce dismissed their proposals with contempt. He knew the Western democracies were weary of war and lacked the political courage to stop him. On October 3, 1935, without a formal declaration of war, the Italian army crossed the Merb River from Eritrea into Ethiopia. The invasion was personally directed by Mussolini from his desk in Rome, issuing constant operational commands over telegraph wires to his commanders in the field. The Italian invasion force was commanded initially by General Emilio de Bono, one of the original fascist quadriumvirs. Armed with modern tanks, heavy artillery, armored cars, and an overwhelming fleet of combat aircraft, the Italian army moved southward into the rugged Ethiopian highlands. Standing against them was the Imperial Ethiopian Army, a brave but poorly equipped force, many of whose soldiers went into battle wearing white cotton robes and carrying outdated rifles, spears, and swords. Despite their massive technological superiority, the Italian advance was slow. The mountainous terrain was treacherous, supply lines were stretched, and Ethiopian warriors used guerrilla tactics to harass the invaders. Impatient with de Bono's cautious approach, Mussolini fired him in November 1935 and replaced him with General Pietro Badoglio, a cold, ruthless professional military officer. Badoglio was given explicit instructions to use whatever means necessary to achieve total, rapid victory. When the Ethiopian forces launched a fierce counteroffensive in the northern province of Tembian, Badoglio unleashed the full, brutal weight of modern industrial warfare. The Italian Royal Air Force, Regia Aeronautica, took complete control of the skies. Italian bombers systematically dropped high explosives and incendiary weapons on Ethiopian military positions, villages, field hospitals, and Red Cross units. When conventional bombing failed to shatter Ethiopian resistance fast enough, Badoglio authorized the use of chemical weapons, specifically mustard gas ypirite, stored in heavy aerial bombs and spray canisters. Mustard gas was a toxic chemical agent banned by the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which Italy had signed. When dropped from Italian planes, the toxic gas settled like a burning mist over the Ethiopian valleys. It burned the skin, blinded soldiers and peasants, destroyed water supplies, killed livestock, and caused agonizing deaths to thousands of civilians who had no protective gear or medical supplies. Emperor Haile Selassie later described the horrific impact of the chemical attacks before the League of Nations. Special sprayers were installed on aircraft so that they could vaporize over vast areas of territory, a fine, death-dealing rain. Soldiers, women, children, cattle, rivers, lakes, and pastures were drenched continually with this deadly rain, in order to kill off systematically all living creatures. In order to more surely poison waters and pastures, the Italian command made its aircraft pass over and over again. While chemical weapons scorched the countryside, the Italian army advanced steadily toward the capital, destroying the remaining Ethiopian armies at the decisive Battle of Mechu in March 1936. On May 2, 1936, realizing that the capital was doomed, Emperor Haile Selassie boarded a train into exile, traveling to Britain to make a final, desperate appeal to the international community. 3 days later, on May 5, General Badoglio's armored columns marched into Addis Ababa, securing total control of the Ethiopian capital. In Rome, the news reached Mussolini on the evening of May 9, 1936. Standing on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia before a vast, roaring crowd of hundreds of thousands of people, Duce delivered the most triumphant speech of his life. Proclaiming the creation of a new empire, he shouted into the night air, "Italy has her empire at last, a fascist empire, because it bears the indestructible signs of the will and the power of the Roman lictor. Raise your banners, your sky, and your hearts, legionnaires, for after 15 centuries, the empire has reappeared upon the sacred hills of Rome." Mussolini formally declared King Victor Emmanuel Roman III the Emperor of Ethiopia. At home, popular enthusiasm for Duce reached its absolute zenith. Even long-standing critics of the regime were swept up in the wave of nationalist euphoria. It appeared to the Italian public that Mussolini had successfully defied the great powers of the world, avenged the defeat of Idwa, and brought glory back to the motherland. However, behind the triumphant speeches and military parades, the Abyssinian campaign marked the beginning of Mussolini's ultimate downfall. The invasion had provoked international outrage. The League of Nations officially condemned Italy as an aggressor state and voted to impose economic sanctions. These sanctions prohibited member states from selling arms, raw materials, and industrial supplies to Italy, and cut off international credit. The sanctions were largely ineffective because they did not include oil, the one resource Mussolini needed to fuel his war machine, and because key non-member states like the United States and Germany continued to trade with Rome. Furthermore, Britain refused to close the Suez Canal to Italian troop ships, fearing a wider war in the Mediterranean. Yet, while the sanctions failed to save Ethiopia, they had a profound psychological impact on Mussolini. He was deeply angered by what he viewed as the hypocrisy of Britain and France, two global empires that controlled vast colonial territories across Africa and Asia, yet sought to prevent Italy from acquiring its own share. Mussolini used the sanctions to whip up intense anti-Western sentiment within Italy. He launched a national campaign for autarky, economic self-sufficiency, calling on citizens to hand over their gold wedding rings to the state to be melted down into bullion to fund the nation's treasury. Italian women, including Queen Elena, lined up outside public collection centers to exchange their gold bands for steel rings inscribed with the date of the sanctions. The political isolation forced upon Italy by the League of Nations shattered Mussolini's traditional diplomatic alliances. For over a decade, Mussolini had maintained a delicate balance of power in Europe, maintaining friendly ties with Britain and France to counter the rising power of Germany. In 1934, when Austrian Nazis had assassinated Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, Mussolini had mobilized Italian troops on the Brenner Pass to prevent Adolf Hitler from annexing Austria. Now, angered by Western sanctions, and emboldened by his military victory in Africa, Mussolini abandoned his traditional alliance with the Western democracies. He turned his gaze toward Berlin. Adolf Hitler had watched the Abyssinian crisis with great interest. The German dictator admired Mussolini as his political predecessor and took careful note of how weak and hesitant Britain and France had proven to be when confronted with military force. While the rest of Europe condemned the invasion of Ethiopia, Nazi Germany stood by Italy, supplying Mussolini with coal, raw materials, and diplomatic support. In October 1936, Mussolini sent his young, ambitious son-in-law Galeazzo Ciano, whom he had recently appointed foreign minister, to Germany to meet with Hitler. The talks went exceptionally well. Hitler offered full recognition of Italy's new East African empire, and Ciano agreed to closer diplomatic and military coordination between the two authoritarian states. On November 1, 1936, speaking in Milan, Mussolini announced to the world that a new geopolitical alignment had been forged. This vertical line between Rome and Berlin is not a diaphragm, but rather an axis around which can revolve all those European states with a will to collaboration and peace. The Rome-Berlin axis was born. Mussolini believed he was entering into an equal partnership with Germany, one in which he would remain the senior, more experienced statesman guiding the younger German leader. It was a disastrous miscalculation. By turning away from Britain and France and tying Italy's fate to Nazi Germany, Mussolini set his country on a dangerous track he could no longer control. The reality of Italy's new African empire was far from the utopian vision painted by fascist propaganda. Italian rule in East Africa was marked by continuous, brutal resistance from Ethiopian partisan fighters Arbignac. Instead of enjoying peace, Italian colonial forces were forced to wage a permanent, costly counterinsurgency war that drained the state treasury and tied down tens of thousands of frontline troops. In February 1937, an attempt was made on the life of the Italian viceroy of East Africa, General Rodolfo Graziani, in Addis Ababa. In retaliation, Graziani ordered a ferocious massacre that lasted 3 days. Italian troops and Blackshirt squads went on a rampage through the capital, burning thousands of homes, bayoneting civilians, and executing entire communities of intellectuals, monks, and young educated Ethiopians. Known as the Yekatite 12 massacre, the slaughter resulted in the deaths of over 19,000 innocent people, deepening Ethiopian hatred for the occupiers and shattering any illusion that fascist rule brought civilization to Africa. By late 1936, Benito Mussolini had achieved his goal of building an empire, but at a catastrophic cost. The conquest of Ethiopia had exhausted the Italian economy, consumed vast stocks of military ammunition and equipment, exposed the moral bankruptcy of the regime, and isolated Italy from the civilized world. Most fatefully of all, it had cast a long shadow over European diplomacy, driving Duce directly into the arms of Adolf Hitler, a fateful embrace that would ultimately drag Mussolini, his regime, and the nation of Italy into the fires of a global catastrophe. The proclamation of the Rome-Berlin Axis in late 1936 marked a fundamental turning point in Benito Mussolini's foreign policy. For years, Duce had operated as the senior statesman of European fascism. When Adolf Hitler first came to power in Germany in 1933, he was widely regarded as a junior imitator of the Italian dictator. Mussolini had initially treated the German chancellor with condescension, viewing himself as the experienced mentor who could guide and restrain the younger, more radical German leader. Yet, within 2 short years of the Abyssinian triumph, The balance of power between the two dictators inverted completely. As German industrial capacity surged, and Hitler rearmed the Wehrmacht at an astonishing pace, Italy's economic weaknesses and military exhaustion became painfully obvious. Mussolini soon found himself trapped in a dynamic where he was no longer directing events, but reacting to the aggressive initiatives of Nazi Germany, constantly forced to play catch-up to maintain his prestige as a warrior leader. The first major testing ground for this new alliance was the Spanish Civil War, which erupted in July 1936 when General Francisco Franco led a right-wing military coup against the democratically elected Second Spanish Republic. Franco immediately sent urgent appeals for military assistance to both Rome and Berlin. Mussolini jumped at the chance to intervene. His motives were partly strategic. He wanted to establish a third fascist state on the border of France and secure naval bases in the Balearic Islands to dominate the Western Mediterranean. But his motives were also ideological. Mussolini was eager to prove the martial strength of his fascist state and strike a blow against international communism. What was intended to be a quick, victorious military campaign dragged on for nearly 3 brutal years. Mussolini dispatched a massive military force to Spain, known as the Corpo Truppe Volontarie, CTV. At its peak, over 70,000 Italian soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and dozens of fighter squadrons were operating on Spanish soil. The intervention turned into a military and financial disaster for Italy. The Italian army suffered a humiliating defeat in March 1937 at the Battle of Guadalajara, where light Italian armored cars were bogged down in mud and routed by Republican forces, which included the anti-fascist Italian volunteers of the Garibaldi Battalion. The loss shattered the myth of fascist military invincibility that Mussolini had spent 15 years constructing. To salvage his pride, Mussolini poured even more resources into Spain. By the time Franco finally achieved victory in April 1939, the Spanish campaign had bled Italy dry. Thousands of Italian soldiers had died, and the state treasury had spent over 14 billion lire, roughly a third of Italy's entire annual revenue. Millions of artillery shells, trucks, tanks, and aircraft were left behind or destroyed, leaving the Italian armed forces dangerously depleted at the precise moment when a major European war was looming on the horizon. While Mussolini drained his military reserves in Spain, Hitler was busy reshaping the map of Central Europe. In March 1938, Hitler executed the Anschluss, the military annexation of Austria into the German Reich. Just 4 years earlier, when Austrian Nazis had attempted a similar move, Mussolini had mobilized Italian divisions on the Brenner Pass to defend Austrian independence. But in 1938, isolated from Britain and France and financially dependent on Germany, Mussolini was forced to stand by and watch silently as German troops marched into Vienna. When Hitler called Mussolini to thank him for not interfering, a deeply relieved German chancellor declared, "Mussolini, I shall never forget you for this." Yet behind his public smiles, Mussolini was deeply uneasy. For the first time, the aggressive, military superpower of Nazi Germany shared a direct land border with Italy at the Brenner Pass. Determined to prove that he was still an equal player in European diplomacy, Mussolini attempted to play the role of global peacemaker during the Munich crisis of September 1938. As Hitler threatened to invade Czechoslovakia over the Sudetenland, pulling Europe to the brink of war, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain begged Mussolini to mediate. Mussolini proposed a four-power conference in Munich, where he presented a peace plan that had actually been secretly drafted by German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. The Munich Agreement handed the Sudetenland to Germany and temporarily averted war, earning Mussolini wild cheers when he returned to Italy. Crowds threw flowers at his train, praising him as the savior of peace. But the adulation infuriated Mussolini. He did not want to be remembered as a peacemaker. He wanted his people to crave war. He privately complained to his son-in-law, Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano, "These Italians are celebrating because they think they've escaped a war. I have raised them to be warriors, but they are still just soft bourgeois." Driven by envy over Hitler's bloodless territorial grabs in Austria and Czechoslovakia, Mussolini decided he needed a swift territorial victory of his own. In April 1939, Italian forces launched a sudden invasion of Albania across the Adriatic Sea. The small Balkan kingdom had already been an Italian protectorate in all but name for years. Italian troops quickly overwhelmed the tiny royal army, forcing King Zog into exile and annexing Albania into the Italian crown. It was a cheap, superficial conquest, but it allowed Mussolini to boast that he too was expanding the frontiers of his empire. As the continent drifted rapidly toward total war, the internal character of the fascist regime underwent a dark and radical transformation. Mussolini became obsessed with the idea that the Italian character was too soft, too pleasant, and too tied to Catholic traditions. He wanted to forge a new fascist man, ruthless, hard, and racially pure. To align Italy more closely with Nazi Germany, Mussolini introduced the racial laws, leggi razziali, in the autumn of 1938. Antisemitism had never been a core feature of Italian fascism. During the 1920s and early 1930s, thousands of Italian Jews had been active members of the Fascist Party, and Mussolini himself had previously dismissed Hitler's racial theories as absurd nonsense. But by 1938, determined to prove to Berlin that Italy was a fully totalitarian ally, Mussolini adopted a state-sponsored anti-Semitic campaign. In July 1938, a group of scientists published the Manifesto of Race, a pseudo-scientific document that claimed Italians belonged to a pure Aryan race and declared Jews to be non-Italian aliens. Beginning in September 1938, a series of harsh decrees stripped Italian Jews of their civil rights. Education. Jewish teachers and students were banned from all public schools, high schools, and universities. Public life. Jewish citizens were banned from serving in the military, holding civil service jobs, or belonging to the Fascist Party. Economy. Strict limits were placed on Jewish ownership of property, businesses, and land. Social isolation. Intermarriage between Jews and non-Jewish Italians was strictly forbidden, and foreign Jewish refugees were ordered to be expelled or placed in detention camps. The racial laws were deeply unpopular among the vast majority of the Italian public. The Catholic Church, led by Pope Pius XI, openly condemned the laws as unchristian and unnatural. Many ordinary Italians quietly resisted the decrees, helping Jewish neighbors hide or retain their property. Rather than strengthening the regime, the introduction of racial persecution alienated conservative supporters, lowered public morale, and exposed how completely Mussolini had surrendered his independent judgment to Adolf Hitler. The ultimate symbol of this ideological and military submission came on May 22, 1939, in Berlin, with the signing of the formal military alliance between Italy and Germany, the Pact of Steel, Patto d'Acciaio. The treaty had been negotiated by Galeazzo Ciano and Joachim von Ribbentrop. Mussolini had initially wanted to call the treaty the Pact of Blood, but settled on steel to emphasize industrial and military strength. The Pact of Steel, was one of the most reckless military agreements ever signed by a European power. Standard military alliances are typically defensive, meaning one country agrees to help the other only if it is attacked by an outside aggressor. But the Pact of Steel contained an extraordinary clause, Article Roman III, that bound Italy to go to war immediately if Germany became involved in military operations with any other power, regardless of who started the conflict. Mussolini was fully aware that Italy's military was in no condition to fight a major European conflict. His army was short of artillery, tanks, and trucks. The Navy lacked fuel reserves. The Air Force possessed outdated aircraft, and industrial raw materials like iron, coal, and oil were severely depleted. Before signing the pact, Mussolini gave Hitler an explicit written memorandum, known as the Cavallero Memorandum, stating that Italy would not be ready to participate in a general European war before 1943 at the earliest. Hitler and Ribbentrop verbally reassured Ciano and Mussolini that Germany had no plans to initiate a war anytime soon, promising that Europe would enjoy several years of peace while both powers built up their military forces. It was a complete lie. Hitler had already set the timetable for the invasion of Poland for the end of August 1939. He used the signing of the Pact of Steel simply to secure his southern flank and intimidate Great Britain and France from intervening. In mid-August 1939, as rumors of an impending German invasion of Poland swept through European capitals, a horrified Galeazzo Ciano rushed to Hitler's mountain retreat at Obersalzberg near Berchtesgaden. Ciano discovered to his shock that the Germans were fully mobilized and determined to attack Poland within days. When Ciano reminded Ribbentrop of the promises made in May that war would be avoided for several years, the German foreign minister brushed him off with cold indifference, telling him, "We want war." Ciano returned to Rome in a state of panic and despair, writing in his diary, "I returned to Rome disgusted with the Germans, with their leader, with their way of doing things. They have betrayed us and lied to us." Ciano begged his father-in-law to break the Pact of Steel and keep Italy out of the approaching slaughter. Mussolini was torn apart by deep indecision. On one hand, he knew that entering a major war in 1939 would mean military disaster for Italy. On the other hand, he was terrified of being branded a coward by Hitler and losing his reputation as a formidable dictator. For 2 frantic weeks in late August, Duce swung wildly between declarations of martial defiance and agonizing moments of panic. Finally, Mussolini hit upon a clever diplomatic maneuver to escape his military obligations without officially breaking the alliance. He asked his military chiefs to compile an impossibly massive list of raw materials, fuel, and military equipment that Italy would require from Germany in order to enter the war alongside Berlin. The resulting document, known as the List of Demands, was delivered to Berlin on August 26, 1939. It demanded millions of tons of steel, coal, oil, and artillery batteries, specifying that the supplies must be delivered immediately by rail, a physical impossibility that would have required over 17,000 train cars. Hitler understood the message immediately. Italy was backing out. On September 1, 1939, German armies invaded Poland, triggering the outbreak of World War II as Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later. Unable to fight, yet too proud to declare neutrality like an ordinary peaceful country, Mussolini announced that Italy was adopting a status of non-belligerency. It was a humiliating linguistic compromise that meant Italy was aligned with Germany but not actively fighting. As German panzer divisions sliced through Poland with terrifying speed, Benito Mussolini sat in his study at the Palazzo Venezia, watching the greatest war in human history unfold from the sidelines. He felt humiliated, isolated, and desperate. By binding his country to the Pact of Steel, without the military power to enforce his ambitions, Duce had reduced Italy to a spectator in a world being reshaped by Adolf Hitler, waiting anxiously for the moment when he would feel forced to jump into the raging fire. Throughout the long, dark winter of 1939 and the early spring of 1940, Benito Mussolini paced the floor of his grand office in the Palazzo Venezia like a caged animal. Outside, Europe was at war, but Italy remained stuck in the awkward, humiliating status of non-belligerency. For a man who had spent nearly 2 decades telling the world that fascism was a heroic doctrine of action, courage, and violent conquest, remaining on the sidelines was pure agony. Every morning, Duce read the intelligence reports and foreign newspapers detailing Germany's military movements. He watched with a mixture of intense envy and deep anxiety as Adolf Hitler's war machine achieved breathtaking victories across the continent. In April 1940, German forces struck northern Europe, crushing Denmark in a single day and swiftly conquering Norway. Then, on May 10, 1940, Hitler launched his long-awaited blitzkrieg against France and the Low Countries. German panzer divisions bypassed the heavy fortifications of the Maginot Line, driving through the dense forests of the Ardennes with incredible speed. Within 2 weeks, the French army was collapsing, and British forces were forced into a desperate evacuation from the beaches of Dunkirk. Mussolini was stunned by the speed of the French defeat. He had calculated that the Western Allies would tie Germany down in a long, grueling war of attrition similar to World War I, giving Italy time to rebuild its depleted military reserves. Instead, the French Third Republic, one of the world's premier military powers, was being utterly destroyed in less than a month. Mussolini was overcome by a sudden, desperate fear. He believed that if Italy did not enter the conflict immediately, Germany would win the war alone, dictate the peace terms, and dominate the entire European continent without sharing any of the spoils. He was convinced that the war was practically over, and that only a few weeks of fighting remained. When his top military commanders and political advisors begged him to remain neutral, warning him that the armed forces were completely unprepared for a major war, Mussolini brushed their concerns aside with cynical disregard. Speaking to Marshal Pietro Badoglio, the chief of the General Staff, Mussolini revealed his cold, opportunistic calculation. "I only need a few thousand dead so that I can sit at the peace conference as a belligerent." It was a fatal miscalculation based on pride, vanity, and shallow opportunism. On June 10, 1940, standing on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia, Mussolini announced to a silent, anxious crowd below that Italy had declared war on Great Britain and France. The declaration was greeted with little genuine enthusiasm by the Italian public. Unlike the ecstatic crowds that had cheered the conquest of Ethiopia 4 years earlier, the people of Italy received the news with quiet dread. They knew what Mussolini refused to accept. Italy was totally unready for war. The reality of the Italian military in June 1940 was alarming. Army. The Royal Italian Army, Regio Esercito, looked impressive on paper, boasting over 70 divisions. However, most of these divisions were binary units made up of only 2 regiments instead of the standard 3, created artificially by Mussolini to inflate the total number of divisions for propaganda. The infantry lacked basic modern equipment. Standard soldiers carried the Carcano rifle, a weapon designed in 1891. Anti-tank guns were scarce and weak, radio communications were primitive, and heavy artillery was largely leftover stock from World War I. Armor. Italy had virtually no modern medium or heavy tanks. Italian armored forces relied almost entirely on light L3/35 tankettes, tiny, thin-skinned vehicles armed only with machine guns that soldiers mockingly nicknamed tin cans. The newer M11/39 medium tanks were poorly armored, prone to mechanical breakdown, and featured a main gun mounted in the hull rather than a rotating turret. Air Force. The Regia Aeronautica possessed brave, highly skilled pilots, but its aircraft were rapidly becoming outdated. Italian industrial factories produced biplane fighters like the Fiat CR.42 at a time, when Britain and Germany were flying modern monoplanes like the Spitfire and Messerschmitt Bf 109. Italian aircraft lacked armor protection for pilots, self-sealing fuel tanks, and effective airborne radio equipment. Navy. The Italian Navy, Regia Marina, was the strongest and most modern branch of the armed forces, featuring fast battleships and heavy cruisers. However, it had two fatal weaknesses. It possessed no aircraft carriers, relying entirely on the Air Force for air cover that rarely arrived on time, and it suffered from a severe, chronic shortage of fuel oil. Worse still, Italian military leadership was deeply divided, incompetent, and crippled by bureaucratic rivalry. Mussolini had appointed himself Minister of War, Minister of the Navy, Minister of the Air Force, and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. He insisted on micromanaging minor operational details despite having no professional staff training, while refusing to appoint a single unified high command to coordinate joint operations between the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The immediate consequences of entering the war were felt within days. Mussolini ordered his forces to launch an invasion of southern France across the Alpine border on June 21, 1940. Even though the French army was already crushed by Germany and facing total surrender, 30 Italian divisions struggled to make any progress against a handful of French border garrisons. The Italian soldiers, poorly equipped for mountain warfare and lacking proper winter clothing, were held off at the fortified Little Maginot Line, suffering over 4,000 casualties, including severe frostbite, for a tiny strip of French border territory. It was a deeply embarrassing start, but far worse was to come in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Mussolini viewed the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea, and believed Italy could quickly drive the British out of Egypt and the Middle East. In September 1940, Mussolini ordered Marshal Rodolfo Graziani to launch an invasion of Egypt from the Italian colony of Libya. Graziani, knowing his troops lacked adequate motor transport and water supplies, resisted the order, but Mussolini threatened to fire him if he did not advance immediately. On September 13, 1940, an Italian army of over 150,000 men crossed the Egyptian border. Advancing cautiously along the coast, they covered 60 miles before stopping at Sidi Barrani, where they built a series of isolated, fortified camps in the desert sand, and halted their advance to wait for supplies. While Graziani sat idle in the Libyan desert, Mussolini grew furious watching German forces prepare for the air battle over Britain. Feeling sidelined once again, Duce looked for a theater where he could achieve a dramatic, independent victory without German help. He chose Greece. The decision to invade Greece was made on a whim, driven entirely by personal spite and wounded ego. In mid-October 1940, Hitler unilaterally occupied the oil fields of Romania without informing Mussolini in advance. When Mussolini learned of the German move, he flew into a rage, telling Galeazzo Ciano, "Hitler always presents me with a fait accompli. This time I am going to pay him back in his own coin. He will find out from the newspapers that I have occupied Greece." The invasion of Greece was planned in total secrecy, with zero strategic preparation. Mussolini's generals, eager to please their dictator, assured him that the campaign would be a simple military stroll. They claimed that the Greek dictator, Ioannis Metixis, would offer only token resistance, and that the Greek political structure would collapse within days. On October 28, 1940, the 18th anniversary of the March on Rome, Italian forces launched an invasion of Greece from their bases in occupied Albania. The campaign was a colossal, catastrophic failure from the very first hour. Mussolini had launched the invasion in the middle of the rainy season, forcing his soldiers to advance into the treacherous, roadless mountains of Epirus during freezing storms and mudslides. The Italian supply lines collapsed immediately. Soldiers lacked warm coats, waterproof boots, blankets, and ammunition. Far from surrendering, the Greek army fought with ferocious bravery, defending their homeland with intimate knowledge of the rugged terrain. Within 2 weeks, the Greek counteroffensive stopped the Italian advance cold. By mid-November, Greek troops had pushed the Italian army back across the border into Albania, capturing strategic towns like Corse and Gjirokastër. For the next 5 months, over 500,000 Italian soldiers were pinned down in the freezing Albanian mountains, fighting a desperate, bloody defensive war to prevent being driven into the Adriatic Sea. Thousands of Italian soldiers died not from bullet wounds, but from frostbite, exposure, and disease in the snow-covered trenches. The myth of fascist martial prowess was completely shattered before the eyes of the entire world. While Italian troops were freezing in the mountains of Albania, disaster struck the Italian Navy. On the night of November 11, 1940, the British Royal Navy launched Operation Judgment, a daring attack on the primary Italian naval base at Taranto. 21 outdated Fairey Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers launched from the British aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious flew low over Taranto harbor. Utilizing aerial torpedoes modified with wooden fins to operate in shallow water, the British planes struck the anchored Italian fleet by surprise. Within a few hours, half of Italy's capital ships were put out of action, including 3 battleships, Littorio, Conte di Cavour, and Caio Duilio. The Taranto raid permanently altered the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean, proving the decisive power of naval aviation and severely limiting the Regia Marina's ability to protect supply lines to Africa. 1 month later, the nightmare worsened in North Africa. On December 9, 1940, the British Western Desert Force, consisting of just 36,000 highly mobile, well-trained British and Commonwealth troops equipped with heavy Matilda tanks, launched Operation Compass against Graziani's fortified camps at Sidi Barrani. What was intended to be a localized British raid turned into one of the most complete routes in military history. The heavy British Matilda tanks were completely immune to Italian anti-tank fire. British armored columns bypassed the static Italian camps, encircled entire divisions, and drove them back across the Libyan border in total panic. Over the next 10 weeks, the British force advanced 500 miles across North Africa, capturing the strategic coastal fortresses of Bardia, Tobruk, and Benghazi. At the Battle of Bidaf Fam in February 1941, the remainder of the Italian 10th Army was cut off and destroyed. The numbers were staggering. For the loss of fewer than 2,000 casualties, the British destroyed an entire Italian army of 10 divisions, capturing over 130,000 Italian prisoners, 400 tanks, and 850 artillery pieces. Italian colonial rule in Cyrenaica collapsed completely. By the early spring of 1941, Mussolini's parallel war had crumbled into total ruin. Italy was facing military catastrophe on every front. In East Africa, British and Imperial forces launched a multi-pronged invasion of Italian East Africa. The Italian garrisons, completely isolated from Rome, were defeated in detail. On May 5, 1941, 5 years to the day after Badoglio had captured Addis Ababa, Emperor Haile Selassie rode triumphantly back into his capital, restoring Ethiopian independence and ending Mussolini's short-lived East African Empire. In Albania, the army remained hopelessly bogged down in a miserable war of attrition against Greece. In Libya, the remnants of the Italian military were on the verge of being swept out of North Africa entirely. Desperate to avoid total military collapse, Mussolini was forced to perform the ultimate act of humiliation. He begged Adolf Hitler to save him. Hitler was furious. The Italian military failures had completely disrupted Germany's strategic timetable. By invading Greece without warning, Mussolini had allowed British troops to land in Greece and establish airfields that directly threatened the vital Romanian oil fields, the primary source of fuel for the German war machine. Furthermore, Hitler was forced to delay his planned invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, by several critical weeks, in order to clean up the mess his Italian partner had created in the Balkans and North Africa. The German response was swift, overwhelming, and effective. In February 1941, Hitler dispatched General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to Tripoli to stabilize the North African front. Rommel immediately launched a brilliant counteroffensive that drove the British back across the desert, rescuing the Italian forces from total destruction. In April 1941, the German Wehrmacht launched a massive, brutal invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. In less than 3 weeks, German panzer divisions crushed both nations, driving British forces off the Greek mainland and forcing Greece to surrender. When the Greek government signed the instrument of surrender, they initially offered it exclusively to the German army, refusing to acknowledge the Italian forces whom they had defeated in the field. Only after Hitler personally intervened was a second surrender ceremony arranged to include Italian officers, a pathetic, empty gesture that fooled no one. The military rescues by Germany saved Mussolini's regime from immediate collapse, but they came at a fatal political price. The concept of an independent Italian parallel war was dead. Italy was no longer an equal partner in the Axis alliance. It had been reduced to a satellite state, completely subordinate to the strategic decisions and military power of Nazi Germany. Inside Italy, the public mood plummeted into dark, bitter disillusionment. The myth of Duce as an infallible military genius was permanently destroyed. The home front was suffering terribly. As the British Royal Navy instituted a strict blockade, severe food rationing was introduced across the country. Staples like bread, pasta, meat, and coffee became scarce, giving rise to a massive black market controlled by corrupt fascist officials. Italian cities in the north, Milan, Turin, and Genoa, were subjected to terrifying night bombing raids by the Royal Air Force, destroying historic centers and displacing tens of thousands of working-class families. Letters sent home from soldiers on the front painted a grim picture of military incompetence, bad food, lack of clothing, and worthless equipment. The Italian people, who had endured nearly 20 years of relentless fascist propaganda promising glory and imperial greatness, now realized that their dictator had led them into a senseless, destructive war they could not win. Mussolini's physical and mental health began to decline rapidly. Suffering from severe internal stomach ulcers exacerbated by constant stress, the dictator grew pale, thin, and increasingly paranoid. He isolated himself inside the Palazzo Venezia, spending hours poring over trivial reports while ignoring the massive strategic collapse happening around him. He blamed the Italian people for his failures, bitterly complaining that they were a lazy, weak race unworthy of his grand imperial vision. Yet, despite the catastrophic failures in France, North Africa, and Greece, Mussolini refused to alter his fatal course. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22, 1941, Mussolini insisted on sending an Italian expeditionary force, Corpo di Spedizione Italiano in Russia, or CSIR, to join the campaign. Over 60,000 Italian troops were dispatched to the vast, freezing steppes of Russia, equipped with summer uniforms, thin leather boots, light artillery, and inadequate transport, to fight against the Red Army. By 1942, Mussolini expanded this force into the Italian Eighth Army, sending over 200,000 men into the Russian meat grinder. 6 months later, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Mussolini blindly followed Hitler's lead once again, declaring war on the United States, a nation with an industrial capacity and population that dwarfed Italy's meager resources. By the end of 1941, Benito Mussolini had dragged his unready, exhausted nation into a global conflict against the greatest economic and military superpowers on Earth: Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The trap was fully set. The unready war that Mussolini had entered for a quick taste of glory was now turning into a relentless, engulfing nightmare that would consume his empire, shatter his dictatorship, and bring total destruction to the nation of it. By the spring of 1943, the grand illusions of fascist empire had dissolved into the smoke and rubble of a ruined nation. The decision to enter World War II alongside Nazi Germany, a conflict for which Italy was utterly unprepared, had dragged the country into an endless sequence of military disasters. The Italian Eighth Army had been virtually annihilated during the Soviet winter counteroffensives on the Don River, leaving over 80,000 Italian soldiers dead, frozen, or captured. In East Africa, the short-lived empire had vanished entirely. And in North Africa, the once confident Axis armies were driven into a tight, hopeless pocket in Tunisia. In May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 250,000 Italian and German soldiers were marched into Allied prisoner-of-war camps, including the last remaining battle-hardened divisions of the Royal Italian Army. The Mediterranean, which Benito Mussolini had proudly claimed as Mare Nostrum, our sea, was now completely controlled by the British Royal Navy and the United States Navy. The barrier protecting the Italian mainland had crumbled. For the first time since the rise of fascism, the war was coming home. On the home front, daily life had become a miserable struggle for survival. Italian cities were subjected to heavy, relentless bombing raids by Allied air forces. Industrial centers like Turin, Milan, and Genoa, along with southern ports like Naples and Palermo, were hammered week after week. Thousands of civilians died in the wreckage, and hundreds of thousands fled into the countryside as homeless refugees. Food rationing had reduced daily caloric intake to near starvation levels. The official ration allowed for barely 150 grams of bread per day, while basic staples like olive oil, meat, sugar, and pasta were virtually unobtainable through legal means. Corrupt fascist officials ran thriving black market operations, selling basic foodstuffs at exorbitant prices that ordinary working families could never afford. Popular outrage finally boiled over in March 1943, led by industrial workers in the manufacturing plants of Turin and Milan. Over 100,000 workers walked off their jobs in a wave of illegal strikes. It was the first major mass strike action in a fascist-controlled state in over 18 years. While the workers protested primarily over food shortages and low wages, the political message behind the unrest was unmistakable. The Italian people were exhausted, disillusioned, and desperate for an end to Mussolini's war. Mussolini himself was a broken man, both physically and mentally. The 59-year-old dictator suffered from severe, agonizing stomach ulcers that left him bedridden for days at a time. He had grown pale, emaciated, and deeply paranoid. He isolated himself inside his official residence, Villa Torlonia, and his office at the Palazzo Venezia, refusing to listen to realistic military reports. When his advisors tried to explain the desperation of the military situation, Duce flew into fits of rage or drifted into silent, glassy-eyed apathy. He was increasingly trapped in a web of his own propaganda. Mussolini knew that the Italian people hated Nazi Germany, but he felt bound to Adolf Hitler by a strange combination of personal pride, fear, and fatalism. Even as his nation disintegrated around him, he could not bring himself to break the Pact of Steel. The final phase of the crisis began in the early morning hours of July 10, 1943. Under the cover of darkness, a massive Allied invasion fleet launched Operation Husky, the amphibious invasion of Sicily. Over 160,000 American, British, and Canadian troops landed on the southern shores of the island. The defense of Sicily collapsed with alarming speed. While elite German units offered tough resistance, many Italian coastal units, manned by poorly equipped, demoralized conscripts who had no desire to die for a lost cause, surrendered en masse or simply threw down their weapons and walked home. Within days, Allied columns were sweeping across the island, welcomed by local Sicilians who greeted the soldiers not as conquerors, but as liberators bringing white bread, cigarettes, and an end to the war. The fall of Sicily sent shockwaves through the political establishment in Rome. It was now brutally obvious that the Allied forces would soon cross the Strait of Messina and invade the Italian mainland itself. 9 days after the landings in Sicily, on July 19, 1943, Mussolini flew to Feltre in northern Italy for a high-level summit with Adolf Hitler. Mussolini intended to tell the German dictator frankly that Italy could no longer continue fighting and needed to negotiate a separate peace. However, when the two dictators met, Hitler dominated the meeting completely. For 3 agonizing hours, Hitler berated Mussolini and his military staff, shouting about Italian incompetence, demanding harsher measures against deserters, and insisting that Italy must mobilize every remaining resource to defend the southern front. Intimidated by Hitler's intensity and weakened by his own illness, Mussolini sat slumped in his chair, remaining completely silent. He never raised the topic of ending the war. While Mussolini was failing at Feltre, catastrophic news arrived from Rome. Shortly before 11 a.m. on July 19, over 500 American heavy bombers launched a massive daylight air raid against the capital city. The attack targeted the strategic rail yards of San Lorenzo, but bombs fell across surrounding residential neighborhoods, killing over 1,500 civilians and destroying historic churches and apartment complexes. The bombing of Rome shattered the long-held belief that the Holy City would be spared by the Allies. When King Victor Emmanuel Roman III visited the smoking ruins of San Lorenzo later that afternoon, he was greeted not by cheers, but by angry crowds shouting, "We want peace! Down with Mussolini!" The destruction of San Lorenzo was the catalyst that ignited a political conspiracy that had been quietly building for months inside the highest ranks of the regime. The conspiracy involved 2 distinct groups working toward the same goal: removing Mussolini from power to save Italy from total destruction. The first group operated inside the political establishment of the National Fascist Party, PNF. It was led by Dino Grandi, the former foreign minister and president of the Chamber of Fasces and Corporations. Grandi was a veteran fascist who had participated in the March on Rome in 1922, but he was a pragmatic politician who realized that Mussolini's obsession with Hitler was leading Italy into an abyss. Grandi was secretly supported by Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's own son-in-law and former foreign minister, as well as other prominent party figures like Giuseppe Badai and Emilio de Bono. Grandi believed that by deposing Mussolini through a constitutional vote, the fascist party could preserve its position and hand authority back to the crown. The second group centered around King Victor Emmanuel Roman III and the military high command, led by General Vittorio Ambrosio, chief of the General Staff, and General Giuseppe Castellano. The king had quietly tolerated Mussolini's tyranny for over 20 years, rubber-stamping the destruction of democracy, the murder of political opponents, the Abyssinian War, and the anti-Semitic racial laws. But now, with the monarchy's very survival threatened by imminent Allied conquest and popular revolution, the king decided to act. The conspirators needed a legal framework to execute the coup. Dino Grandi maneuvered to force a meeting of the Fascist Grand Council, the supreme policy-making body of the fascist state. The Grand Council had not been summoned by Mussolini since December 1939. Grandi drafted a formal resolution, known as the Ordine del Giorno, Order of the Day. The motion called for the restoration of the constitutional powers of the Parliament, the King, and the Cabinet, and specifically demanded that supreme command of the armed forces be transferred back from Mussolini to King Victor Emmanuel Roman III. Mussolini, blind to the true depth of the conspiracy, foolishly agreed to convene the meeting. He believed he could easily dominate his subordinates as he had done for 2 decades. At 5:00 p.m. on Saturday, July 24, 1943, 28 members of the Fascist Grand Council gathered in the grand boardroom of the Palazzo Venezia. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Many members brought hidden hand grenades and pistols under their jackets, fearing that Mussolini's Blackshirt bodyguard, MVSN, might launch an armed assault on the meeting. Mussolini opened the session with a long, rambling, 2-hour speech. Looking pale and exhausted, he attempted to defend his military record, shifting the blame for Italy's defeats onto incompetent generals, bad luck, and the alleged cowardice of the Italian people. He insisted that Italy must remain faithful to the Axis alliance and continue fighting alongside Germany. Dino Grandi then floored to present his resolution. In a fiery, brilliant speech that lasted over an hour, Grandi directly attacked Mussolini's dictatorial style of leadership. We must restore the constitutional institutions of the state. The nation is dying because one man has arrogated all power to himself. We need a real government, a real military command, and the restoration of the king's authority. It is time for Duce to relinquish his dictatorship. Galeazzo Ciano spoke next, backing Grandi and bitterly detailing how Germany had betrayed Italy at the start of the war in 1939. Mussolini stared back at his son-in-law with cold, deadly hatred, whispering to an aide that Ciano was a traitor to his own family. The debate raged through the night for over 7 hours. As the temperature inside the unventilated room soared, members argued furiously over the future of the regime. Mussolini tried to intimidate the council, warning them, "If you pass this resolution, you are putting the very existence of the fascist regime in danger. You are offering the king my head on a silver platter." At 2:15 a.m. on the morning of July 25, 1943, Dino Grandi demanded an immediate vote. The secretary called out the names. 19 members of the council voted in favor of Grandi's motion to strip Mussolini of his military powers. Only 7 voted against it, 1 abstained, and 1 refused to sign. Among those who voted against Mussolini was his own son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano. Mussolini looked around the room at the men he had elevated to power and wealth over 20 years. Stunned, he quietly stood up and declared, "You have provoked the crisis of the regime." He walked out of the room and retired to his private quarters, believing that the vote was merely an advisory political gesture with no real legal consequence. He was catastrophically wrong. Later that morning, Sunday, July 25, Mussolini went to his office at the Palazzo Venezia as if it were an ordinary working day. He even scheduled a brief meeting with the Japanese ambassador. He assumed that King Victor Emmanuel Roman III would support him, ignore the Grand Council's vote, and allow him to make minor changes to his cabinet. Meanwhile, the royal conspiracy was already moving into action. King Victor Emmanuel Roman III accepted the Grand Council's vote as a formal constitutional request to dismiss the dictator. The king appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio, the former commander of the Abyssinian campaign, to serve as the new prime minister of Italy. General Castellano quietly placed paramilitary police forces, carabinieri, on high alert throughout the capital, issuing secret orders for Mussolini's immediate arrest. At 5:00 p.m. on July 25, Mussolini arrived at the royal residence, Villa Savoia, for an audience with the king. He was dressed in a simple civilian suit and carried a briefcase containing a copy of Grandi's resolution. The audience lasted less than 20 minutes. King Victor Emmanuel Roman III met Mussolini in the drawing room and got straight to the point. The king informed Mussolini that he was being replaced as prime minister by Marshal Badoglio. The king spoke coldly to his former dictator. "My dear Duce, it cannot go on any longer. Italy is in pieces. Army morale has reached the bottom. The soldiers don't want to fight anymore. The vote of the Grand Council is tremendous. You are the most hated man in Italy today. You have no friends left except me, but I can no longer protect you." Mussolini was utterly shattered. He tried to argue, his voice shaking. "Then my work is finished. This is a severe blow to my prestige. What will happen to me?" "I will personally guarantee your safety," the king replied, ending the audience. Mussolini walked out the front doors of the Villa Savoia into the hot summer afternoon. He expected to see his official car and Blackshirt security escort waiting for him. Instead, a carabinieri officer, Captain Paolo Vigneri, approached him, saluted, and asked him to step inside a nearby military ambulance for his own protection. Mussolini hesitated, pointing to his private car, but Vigneri firmly guided him by the elbow into the rear of the ambulance. 2 armed police officers stepped in beside him and pulled the curtains shut. The ambulance sped out of the gates, taking the fallen dictator into secret military custody. Benito Mussolini's 21-year total dictatorship had ended not with a dramatic battle or a grand heroic gesture, but with a silent arrest in the driveway of the royal palace. At 10:45 p.m. that evening, normal radio programming across Italy was interrupted by a dramatic news bulletin. A newsreader announced that King Victor Emmanuel Roman III had accepted the resignation of Benito Mussolini as head of government and appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as prime minister. The announcement concluded with a stern warning from Badoglio. "The war continues. Italy will keep its promises to its allies." Despite Badoglio's attempt to keep the peace with Germany, the news triggered a massive, spontaneous outburst of wild joy across the nation. Millions of Italians poured into the streets in the middle of the night, laughing, weeping, hugging strangers, and celebrating the end of the dictatorship. People climbed onto balconies to tear down fascist flags and posters. Blackshirt headquarters were ransacked, and statues, busts, and portraits of Duce were smashed in street gutters. The public felt an overwhelming sense of relief, convinced that the fall of Mussolini meant an immediate end to the war and the return of peace. Crucially, not a single Blackshirt unit raised a weapon to defend their fallen dictator. The party that had claimed to possess millions of fanatical warriors collapsed like a house of cards overnight. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was driven into a furious rage when he received news of Mussolini's arrest. He immediately saw through Badoglio's claim that the war continues, recognizing it as a stalling tactic, while Italy secretly negotiated a surrender with the Western Allies. Hitler immediately ordered the Wehrmacht to execute Operation Alaric, the military occupation of Italy. German divisions began pouring across the Alpine passes, securing key rail junctions, mountain passes, and coastal fortifications across the northern half of the country. Mussolini, meanwhile, was moved secretly from one hidden location to another to prevent German rescue teams or angry Italian crowds from finding him. He was held first at a naval base on the island of Ponza, then moved to the island of La Maddalena off the coast of Sardinia. Finally, as German intelligence closed in on his whereabouts, the Italian government moved him to a remote, snow-bound ski resort high in the Apennine Mountains, the Hotel Campo Imperatore on the Grand Sasso Peak. Perched over 6,000 feet above sea level and accessible only by a single cable car, the mountain hotel seemed like an unassailable prison. Mussolini spent his days staring out of his hotel window at the desolate mountain peaks, convinced that his political career was finished, his life was over, and that he would soon be handed over to the Allies to stand trial as a war criminal. He had fallen from the absolute peak of imperial power to the quiet isolation of a mountain prisoner in less than a month. Yet, unbeknownst to the broken dictator sitting alone in his cold hotel room, his fate was still tied to Adolf Hitler, and his long, painful walk through the nightmare of war was far from over. In late August 1943, Benito Mussolini sat alone in a bedroom on the second floor of the Hotel Campo Imperatore, a remote ski resort perched over 6,000 feet high in the Apennine Mountains of Abruzzo. Isolated from the outside world, the deposed dictator believed his political career was finished. His stomach ulcers caused him constant physical pain, and he spent long, quiet hours staring out at the rocky, fog-shrouded peaks, convinced that the Italian government would soon hand him over to the Allies to face trial as a war criminal. Down in Rome, the government of Marshal Pietro Badoglio was playing a double game. Publicly, Badoglio continued to reassure Adolf Hitler that Italy remained committed to the Axis alliance. Privately, Italian diplomats were holding secret negotiations in Lisbon and Sicily with Anglo-American representatives. On September 3, 1943, in an olive grove near Cassibile, Sicily, General Giuseppe Castellano signed an unconditional surrender on behalf of the Italian crown. The announcement of the armistice was broadcast to the world on the evening of September 8, 1943. The news triggered chaos across the Italian peninsula. King Victor Emmanuel Roman III, Marshal Badoglio, and the top military leadership offered no clear operational orders to the armed forces. Fearing German retaliation, the king and his government fled Rome in the middle of the night, abandoning the capital and escaping south to the Allied-held port of Brindisi. Left without instructions or leadership, the Italian armed forces collapsed entirely. Over 600,000 Italian soldiers were disarmed and taken prisoner by German forces across France, the Balkans, and Italy, while hundreds of thousands threw away their uniforms and tried to reach their homes on foot. Hitler reacted with cold, calculated efficiency. Armed with pre-planned military blueprints, German forces moved swiftly to occupy Rome, northern Italy, and central Italy. At the same time, Hitler was determined to rescue his fallen partner. He believed that restoring Mussolini as the nominal leader of a new Italian state would legitimize German military occupation, tie down Italian resources, and prevent the northern industrial region from descending into total anarchy. The rescue operation, codenamed Operation Oak, Unternehmen Eike, was personally ordered by Hitler and planned by General Kurt Student of the German Luftwaffe. On the afternoon of September 12, 1943, 10 DFS-230 troop-carrying gliders descended silently out of the clouds, crash-landing on the steep, stony slopes right beside the Hotel Campo Imperator. Dozens of elite German paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, accompanied by SS officer Otto Skorzeny, leaped out of the gliders with automatic weapons drawn. Italian guards at the resort, caught completely by surprise and under orders from a captured Italian general not to shoot, surrendered without firing a single shot. Within minutes, Skorzeny burst into Mussolini's hotel room, dramatically declaring, "Duce, the Führer has sent me to free you." A bewildered and visibly shaken Mussolini was escorted down the mountain and packed into a tiny, single-engine Fieseler Fi-156 Storch reconnaissance plane. The overloaded aircraft bounced precariously along the rocky mountain plateau before dropping over the edge of the cliff, barely lifting into the air. Mussolini was flown to an airfield near Rome, transferred to a German transport plane, and flown directly to Hitler's military headquarters, the Wolf's Lair Wolfschanz, in the dense forests of East Prussia. The reunion between the two dictators on September 14 was a strange, grim affair. Hitler welcomed Mussolini warmly, but he was shocked by his friend's physical appearance. The once boastful dictator was thin, frail, pale, and dressed in a rumpled civilian coat that hung loosely over his shrunken frame. Mussolini expressed a desire to retire from public life, citing his failing health and a wish to spend his remaining years with his family. Hitler would hear none of it. Coldly and firmly, the German Chancellor presented Mussolini with a stark ultimatum. Duce would return to northern Italy immediately to establish a new, hard-line fascist government, or the German army would treat all of northern Italy as occupied enemy territory, destroy its manufacturing cities, and execute thousands of Italian hostages in retaliation for the treason of July 25. Faced with Hitler's unyielding pressure and realizing he had no alternative, Mussolini submitted. He was no longer an independent world leader or a respected ally. He was a political instrument of the German Reich. On September 18, 1943, speaking from a radio studio in Munich, Mussolini delivered his first address to the Italian people in nearly 2 months. His voice sounded flat, tired, and devoid of its old rhetorical fire. He denounced the king, Badoglio, and the traitors of the Grand Council, announcing the creation of a new Republican fascist regime, the Italian Social Republic, Repubblica Social Italiana, or RSI, because Rome was too close to the front lines and subject to Allied bombing. The administrative offices of the new state were scattered across small towns in northern Italy. Mussolini set up his official residence and office at Salò, a quiet, picturesque town on the western shore of Lake Garda. From that point forward, the regime was informally known to the world as the Salò Republic. The Salò Republic was a tragic, bloody ghost of the original fascist state. It possessed all the formal paraphernalia of a sovereign nation: a flag, government ministries, a radio station, newspapers, and security forces. but it lacked true power. German military commanders and SS generals controlled every vital aspect of public life. German guards monitored Mussolini's residence at Villa Feltrinelli, read his mail, tapped his phone lines, and decided who was allowed to visit him. Mussolini was well aware of his humiliating position, privately telling an aide, "I am nothing more than a prisoner of the Germans, a ghost pushing papers." In an effort to win back popular support among the working class, Mussolini claimed that the RSI was returning to the pure, radical socialist roots of early fascism. In November 1943, the regime issued the Verona Manifesto, a political program that promised the nationalization of heavy industry, land reform for peasants, profit sharing for factory workers, and the formal abolition of the monarchy. However, the workers of northern Italy saw through the empty propaganda. They knew that the industrial factories of Turin and Milan were working around the clock to supply the German war machine, while Italian raw materials and machinery were being dismantled and shipped to Germany. In March 1944, over 300,000 workers across northern Italy launched a massive general strike, the largest industrial strike in occupied Europe during World War II. The strike crippled production for a week, demonstrating that the working class rejected Mussolini's puppet state entirely. Driven by a bitter desire for revenge against those who had deposed him in July 1943, Mussolini allowed the radical elements of his party to organize the notorious Verona trial in January 1944. 6 prominent former members of the fascist Grand Council who had been captured by German and Italian police were placed on trial for high treason. Among the accused was Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's own son-in-law, who was married to his favorite daughter, Etta. Etta Mussolini made desperate, frantic appeals to her father to save her husband's life, pleading with him for the sake of her children. Mussolini was torn between personal affection and political fanaticism, but German authorities insisted that treason must be punished with death to set an example. Mussolini refused to intervene or commute the sentences. On the morning of January 11, 1944, in a shooting range in Verona, Galeazzo Ciano and 4 other former high-ranking fascist officials, including 77-year-old Marshal Emilio de Bono, one of the original quadrivirs of the March on Rome, were tied to chairs with their backs to a firing squad and executed. The execution of his own son-in-law permanently shattered Mussolini's family, drove Etta into lifelong exile in Switzerland, and proved to the world how completely ill Duce had surrendered his humanity to satisfy his German masters. As the political authority of Salò withered, northern Italy descended into the horrific cruelty of a full-scale civil war. Spontaneously, across the mountains, valleys, and countryside of northern and central Italy, an anti-fascist partisan movement, Resistenza, erupted into action. Composed of communists, socialists, Catholics, liberals, and former army soldiers, the partisans organized into guerrilla bands, forming the National Liberation Committee, CLN. Operating from remote mountain hideouts in the Alps and Apennines, the partisans waged a relentless, effective war against the occupiers, blowing up railway tracks, ambushing German supply columns, assassinating fascist officials, and liberating entire rural valleys. To suppress the partisan insurgency, the Salò Republic created its own fanatical paramilitary forces, most notably the Black Brigades, Brigate Nere, under the leadership of the ruthless party secretary Alessandro Pavellini. Composed of hardline fascists, criminals, and impressionable young zealots, the Black Brigades fought the partisans with unimaginable brutality. Northern Italy became a landscape of terror. Partisan fighters caught by fascist or German forces were routinely tortured, hanged from lampposts in public squares, or executed by firing squad, their bodies left on display for days as a warning to local populations. In response, partisan units executed captured Blackshirt officers and ambushed isolated patrols. German occupation forces, led by SS General Karl Wolff and Wehrmacht commanders, executed systematic reprisal policies against Italian civilians. Under standing orders, 10 Italian civilians were to be executed for every German soldier killed by partisan attacks. The most notorious example occurred on March 24, 1944, at the Ardeatine Caves near Rome, where SS troops executed 335 Italian hostages, including military officers, priests, Jews, and political prisoners, in revenge for a partisan bomb attack in the capital. Similar massacres wiped out entire civilian communities in rural villages like Sant'Anna di Stazzema, where over 500 civilians, mostly women and children, were slaughtered, and Marzabotto, where over 700 innocent people were murdered by SS units. Mussolini watched these horrors unfold with a mix of helplessness and cynical indifference. He occasionally sent written protests to German commanders about the brutality of their reprisals, but his complaints were routinely ignored by SS leaders who viewed him as an irrelevant nuisance. The Salò period also marked the most tragic chapter for Italy's Jewish population. Under the direct orders of the RSI regime, and enforced by the SS, the anti-Semitic policies introduced in 1938 escalated into systematic deportation and genocide. In November 1943, the Salò government issued Police Order No. 5, declaring all Jews living on Italian territory to be enemy aliens, and ordering their immediate arrest and the confiscation of all their property. Italian police officers and Blackshirt militia units actively hunted down Jewish families across northern Italy, imprisoning them in transit camps such as Piazzale and Risiera di San Saba near Trieste. From these transit camps, over 8,500 Italian Jews were packed into cattle cars and deported to Nazi extermination camps, primarily Auschwitz-Birkenau. The vast majority were murdered in gas chambers upon arrival, while thousands of ordinary Italian citizens, priests and nuns, heroically risked their lives to hide Jewish neighbors in cellars, monasteries, and farms. The Salò Republic served as an active, willing accomplice in the Holocaust. By the winter of 1944, the military situation of the Axis was hopeless. The Allied armies had broken through the winter line in central Italy, liberated Rome in June 1944, and were grinding their way north through the heavily fortified Gothic line in the Apennine Mountains. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Red Army was closing in on Berlin, while Western Allied armies were advancing through France and Germany. Inside Villa Feltrinelli at Salò, Benito Mussolini was a broken, pathetic figure. He spent his days writing defensive historical memoirs, trying to justify his past political choices and blaming everyone else for the catastrophe that had consumed Italy. He knew that the end was rapidly approaching. His health continued to deteriorate, his support among the population had vanished, and he was hated by millions of his own countrymen. On December 16, 1944, Mussolini made his final major public appearance, traveling to Milan to deliver a speech at the Loreto Theater. Surrounded by a heavily armed SS escort, he spoke to a carefully selected audience of party loyalists. He tried to project defiance, claiming that secret German weapons would soon turn the tide of the war and restore the Axis to victory. The audience offered enthusiastic applause, but outside the theater doors, the streets of Milan were quiet, cold, and hostile. It was a pathetic, empty performance, the final bow of a fallen actor who knew the theater was burning down around him. As the spring of 1945 approached, the melting snow in the mountains opened the way for the final Allied offensive in Italy. The partisans were now over 200,000 strong, armed with British and American weapons dropped by air, and controlling vast swaths of the countryside. The German army in Italy was exhausted, short of fuel, and on the verge of total collapse. Mussolini's puppet state was dissolving hour by hour. The administrative offices in Salò were abandoned as officials fled, burned files, or tried to secure fake identification papers. On April 18, 1945, Mussolini left Lake Garda for the last time and moved his quarters to the prefect's palace in Milan. He hoped to make a final stand in the mountains of the Valtellina near the Swiss border, or negotiate terms of surrender that would save his life. But he was living in a world of pure delusion. The partisans were preparing for a general armed uprising across all of northern Italy, and the German military commanders in Italy were already secretly negotiating their own separate surrender to the Allies behind Duce's back. The weary, powerless figurehead who had once ruled a grand Mediterranean empire had reached the end of his road. The puppet strings were about to be cut, leaving Benito Mussolini to face the final, terrifying judgment of the Italian people. By late April 1945, the illusion of the Italian Social Republic had dissolved completely. The Allied armies had broken through the German defenses along the Gothic line, flooding into the Po Valley, while a general anti-fascist uprising paralyzed every major town across northern Italy. Benito Mussolini sat in the prefect's palace in Milan, surrounded by a handful of terrified aides, his devoted mistress Clara Petacci, and a fanatical remnant of Blackshirts led by Alessandro Pavellini. The dictator was 61 years old, broken in health, and desperate to escape the judgment that was rapidly closing in on him. On the afternoon of April 25, 1945, Cardinal Alfredo Ildefonso Schuster arranged a secret meeting at the Archbishop's palace in Milan. Mussolini hoped to negotiate a peaceful surrender with representatives of the partisan National Liberation Committee, CLN, seeking guarantees for his personal safety and the lives of his remaining followers. The negotiation ended in bitter failure. The partisan delegate, Walter Audicio, made it clear that the anti-fascists demanded total, unconditional surrender. To make matters worse, Mussolini learned during the meeting that General Karl Wolff, the commander of German forces in Italy, had been secretly negotiating a separate surrender with the Western Allies behind his back for weeks. Realizing that his German allies had betrayed him and that the partisans intended to put him on trial, Mussolini stormed out of the palace in a rage. "They have treated us like pawn pieces," he shouted to his aides. Returning to his headquarters, he ordered his party leadership to abandon Milan immediately. That night, a convoy of civilian cars and military vehicles slipped quietly out of Milan, heading north toward the picturesque shore of Lake Como. Mussolini's plan was vague and desperate. He hoped to reach the Swiss border to seek political asylum, or perhaps hide out in the rugged mountain peaks of the Valtellina to make a suicidal last stand. Accompanying him was Clara Petacci, who had steadfastly refused to leave his side despite his pleas for her to flee to safety. Behind them rode a chaotic retinue of fascist ministers, bodyguards, and a contingent of heavy armored cars carrying German SS troops whose sole task was to escort the former Duce toward the German frontier. The convoy reached the city of Como around midnight, but local authorities could offer no protection. The roads were swarming with armed partisan bands, and Swiss border guards had already tightened security, under strict orders to turn away any fleeing high-ranking fascists. The column pressed on, crawling along the narrow, winding road that hugged the western shore of Lake Como. On the morning of April 27, 1945, the convoy reached the small lakeside village of Dongo. A roadblock made of fallen trees and heavy boulders blocked the road, manned by armed partisans of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, led by a young communist commander named Count Urbano Lazzaro, known by his nom de guerre, Bill. When the partisans opened fire, the German officers in the convoy called for a truce to negotiate. The German commander explained that his troops were simply returning to Germany and wanted safe passage. The partisan leaders agreed to let the German soldiers pass on one condition. Every Italian in the convoy had to be handed over for inspection, and no high-ranking fascist officials would be permitted to escape. Realizing that his German bodyguards were willing to trade him for their own survival, Mussolini tried a desperate disguise. He put on a heavy German military overcoat, slipped on a pair of dark sunglasses, and pulled a heavy Luftwaffe helmet low over his forehead. He then climbed into the back of a German military truck, sitting slouched in a corner among weary, blanket-trapped German soldiers, pretending to be a drunk, sleeping trooper. The trick failed completely. As the partisans inspected the back of the truck, Giuseppe Negri, a former Italian sailor turned partisan, noticed the man huddled in the corner. Despite the coat, helmet, and sunglasses, Negri instantly recognized the heavy jawline, shaved head, and prominent features of the man whose face had been plastered across public buildings, newspapers, and textbooks for over 2 decades. Negri stepped up into the truck, tapped the man on the shoulder, and said quietly, "Comrade Benito Mussolini is here." Mussolini offered no resistance. He stood up slowly, climbed down from the truck without saying a word, and allowed himself to be disarmed. The partisans searched his personal briefcase, discovering secret correspondence with Winston Churchill, state documents, and thousands of Swiss francs and gold coins. Clara Petacci, along with top fascist officials including Alessandro Pavellini and Cabinet Secretary Nicola Bombacci, were also identified and arrested nearby. Fearing that local fascist sympathizers might attempt a rescue, or that Allied forces might demand Mussolini be handed over for an international trial, the partisan commanders decided to move their famous prisoner to a secure, isolated location. Late that night, under a pouring rain, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were transferred to a small, remote farmhouse in the tiny village of Giulino di Mezzegra, high above Lake Como. The farmhouse belonged to a local peasant family, the de Marias, who provided the couple with a simple bed and hot coffee. It would be Mussolini's last night alive. Back in Milan, the leadership of the National Liberation Committee met to decide the dictator's fate. They remembered the horrific atrocities committed by the Black Brigades, the summary executions of partisans, and the brutal massacres of Italian civilians during the Civil War. They agreed that Mussolini must not be turned over to the Americans or subjected to months of courtroom legalities. The CLN issued a directive that Mussolini and his inner circle should be executed immediately under summary military justice. On the afternoon of April 28, 1945, a partisan officer named Walter Odisio, code-named Colonel Valerio, arrived at the De Maria farmhouse. Odisio entered the bedroom and informed Mussolini and Petacci that he had come to rescue them. The couple was bundled into the back of a small Fiat car and driven a short distance down the winding mountain lane to the entrance of Villa Belmont. Odisio ordered the car to stop. He instructed Mussolini and Petacci to step out and stand against the stone wall beside the iron gates of the villa. Realizing what was happening, Clara Petacci threw her arms around Mussolini, screaming and attempting to shield his body with her own. Odisio drew his submachine gun, shouting at her to step aside. When she refused, he opened fire. Petacci was struck first and collapsed to the ground. Mussolini opened his coat, beat his chest, and shouted his final words. "Shoot me in the chest." Audicio pulled the trigger, firing a burst of bullets directly into Mussolini's torso. The dictator collapsed against the wall, dying instantly at 4:10 p.m. on April 28, 1945. Shortly after, 15 other high-ranking fascist officials who had been captured at Dongo, including Alessandro Pavellini, Nicola Bombacci, and Clara's brother Marcello Petacci, were lined up against the quay on the waterfront in Dongo and executed by a partisan firing squad. During the night, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and the executed fascist leaders were loaded into a closed delivery truck and driven back through the darkness to Milan. In the early morning hours of April 29, 1945, the truck dumped the dead bodies onto the concrete floor of Piazzale Loreto, a large public square in northern Milan. The location was chosen with deliberate, symbolic hatred. 8 months earlier, on August 10, 1944, German SS troops and Italian Blackshirts had executed 15 partisan hostages in that exact square, leaving their bloody corpses displayed on the pavement for hours as a warning to the public. Word spread through Milan like wildfire. By mid-morning, an angry, uncontrolled crowd of thousands of citizens had gathered in Piazzale Loreto. The years of war, poverty, police brutality, foreign invasion, and total national ruin erupted into a frenzy of rage. People kicked, spat upon, and trampled the bodies. Women shouted curses, throwing mud and trash at the lifeless form of the man who had once promised them a new Roman Empire. To prevent the mob from completely tearing the corpses apart, local firemen and partisans used ropes to tie the feet of the executed leaders and hoisted them upside down from the steel rafters of an Esso gas station roof on the edge of the square. Hanging side by side in the morning air were the bodies of Benito Mussolini, Clara Petacci, Alessandro Pavellini, Nicola Bombacci, and Achille Stares, the former party secretary who had built much of the cult of Il Duce during the 1930s and who had been caught by chance while jogging through Milan that morning. The sight was horrific, macabre, and deeply tragic, but to the thousands who cheered in the square below, it represented the visceral, final death of fascism in Italy. American military photojournalists captured images of the gruesome scene, and within hours, photographs of the overturned dictator hanging upside down in Milan were printed on the front pages of newspapers across the globe. In Berlin, deep inside the underground Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler received news of Mussolini's execution and the public desecration of his body. Horrified by the news, Hitler resolved that he and his newlywed wife, Eva Braun, would never suffer a similar public humiliation. On April 30, Hitler committed suicide, giving strict instructions that his body be thoroughly burned with gasoline in the Reich Chancellery Garden. Late in the afternoon of April 29, Allied military authorities stepped in to restore order in Milan. Mussolini's body was cut down, removed from Piazzale Loreto, and taken to the city morgue, where an official autopsy was conducted. Fearing that his grave would become a shrine for neo-fascist sympathizers, the Italian government buried Mussolini secretly in an unmarked grave in the Musacco cemetery on the outskirts of Milan. For 12 years, the exact location of his remains remained a guarded state secret. In 1946, a group of neo-fascist diehards dug up his body and stole it, leading to a frantic 4-month search by Italian police before the remains were recovered and hidden in a Franciscan monastery near Pavia. Finally, in August 1957, the Italian government returned Mussolini's remains to his surviving widow, Rachel, and he was permanently laid to rest in his family's private vault in his hometown of Predappio. The death of Benito Mussolini brought a violent end to a turbulent era that had transformed the political landscape of the 20th century. Starting as a radical socialist agitator, Mussolini had manipulated the social anxieties of post-World War Italy to invent a total totalitarian doctrine, fascism, that destroyed Italian democracy and inspired imitators across Europe, most disastrously in Nazi Germany. His boundless personal ambition, reliance on paramilitary violence, and reckless imperialist dreams had led Italy into catastrophic wars, foreign occupation, civil conflict, and total destruction. In the end, the man who had styled himself as the Blackshirt Caesar and ruled Italy with an iron fist for over 2 decades met his end, not on a grand throne or a glorious battlefield,